Assalamu alaikum to all our listeners. In case you all haven't noticed recently, we've had some considerable improvements to our audio quality. This is thanks to donations via our Patreon page, which we've used to reinvest into the podcast and into our software, our hardware, and our microphone equipment. And inshallah wa ta'ala, we're hoping to expand and improve more. And that is entirely through donations. We're, as you probably are aware, non-for-profit. So inshallah, if you have the capacity to help out, if you're a fan of Boys in the Cave and you're excited for the future, we have a lot of things coming, then please inshallah donate to us via Patreon so we can continue to improve for your benefit and for the benefit of the ummah, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim. I'm joined by my co-host Rafael. And alhamdulillah, we're joined by someone very special today. So Asadullah Ali Al-Andalusi is a fellow at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. He acquired a Bachelors of Arts from Benedictine University. I don't know how you say that. Anyways, Benedictine University in Western Philosophy, Masters from the International Islamic University of Malaysia in Philosophy, PhD candidate at University of Georgia in Islamic Studies, and he's currently pursuing his second Masters in Librarian Science. So definitely a lot of credentials there, alhamdulillah. So assalamu alaikum, Asadullah, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair for having me on.
Wayakum. We're definitely honored to have someone like yourself in the cave because I actually follow your social media quite a lot, and you're that guy that I like opening up. Actually, because I mentioned on the Justin Parrott episode, you can actually favorite your posts of specific people you follow on Facebook. So I favorited you. So every time I open my Facebook, it's always a hashtag please reflect. It lightens up my day. But for the audience who don't know what the hashtag please reflect is, do you want to give them a quick summary what that is?
The Please Reflect series is essentially me. It can be a number of things, actually. It's either me trying to elucidate, certain misconceptions about Islam and then, correcting them, or it's me showcasing the erroneous reasoning of a lot of Islamophobes and ex-Muslims, or it's me sometimes just poking fun at a lot of the reasoning from people who hate Islam generally. So showing their inconsistencies, their hypocrisy, etc. And then I put Please Reflect at the end because I want people to understand, the logic and the inconsistencies there.
Yeah, I got actually one example written up here. I'll read it out for people who haven't heard it. It's actually my favorite one, I reckon, at this point in time. So it says, Islamophobe, that guy speaks fluent Arabic and has read the Quran and Hadith. Therefore, he's an expert on Islam and he says Islam is wrong. And me, I speak fluent English and have read your constitutions and history books. Therefore, I'm an expert on Western values. You're wrong. Islamophobe, swear word, please reflect.
Yeah.
That's actually because a lot of the logic they try to use to kind of disprove Islam, if you actually kind of turn it on them, it just falls apart. So
yeah, it tends to be very facile reasoning. That's why it's easy for me to make analogies in response. So
one of the sort of main claims that Muslim apologists have made when combating with key Islamophobes was always the fact that you don't know Arabic, you don't know anything about Islam. So it's really interesting, very core to the kind of Islamophobe movement nowadays is the idea that they need a kind of ex-Muslim or token ex-Muslim that they latch onto for their ideas and their propaganda now. And it's kind of very bedrock. Since Ayaan Hirsi Ali came along, it's a very bedrock part of the Islamophobic narrative and the kind of critiques of Islam, that kind of necessity to have that inside scoop, so to speak. But then in the same vein, we're all English speaking. Like, I'm born here, my parents are born here, my grandparents are born here, my great-grandparents are born here. On one side anyway. But it's like, and I rejected this tradition. And shouldn't that speak even more than someone who probably had quite a superficial knowledge of Islam to start with? And that's kind of the question I wanted to ask. A lot of the ex-Muslims that you encounter and you dialogue with, what would you say about their knowledge of the Islamic tradition? Is it varied? Is it superficial typically? And how does that knowledge relate to their kind of perception of Islam?
Well, there's a lot in that question, actually. First off, I agree with you that there's this sentiment within, especially Western society, where ex-Muslims are seen as experts simply by virtue of being ex-Muslims. And a lot of that has to do with, well, it's a number of reasons. First off, it appeals to what I consider to be something I call Kipling syndrome. And I don't know if you're familiar with Kipling, but he came up with the concept of white man's burden. And, that the Europeans and the Americans have to civilize the rest of the world. And when they find a noble savage, they like to sort of market that individual as a cheerleader for their cause and for their civilization. Likewise, I like to call ex-Muslims Kipling's poster children, because, they help to fulfill that goal from among many people. So, of course, a lot of Westerners find ex-Muslims to be experts simply by virtue of leaving the religion, because it sort of bolsters their narrative. And we can get into more of the psychological reasons behind that, later as well. That said, as to your question, I do find the majority of ex-Muslims that I speak with have a very superficial level of knowledge with regard to Islam, a very superficial level of knowledge in the sense that, they only know very basics, and they tend to exaggerate things or sensationalize things, for their own benefit. And then they come across as saying, well, I've researched this subject, for such a long time. I'm an expert on everything, and I know more than everyone else in this regard. And of course, then you when you question them on more intermediate level things, they can't ever answer, or they respond with the typical phrase, mental gymnastics, which is sort of the go-to phrase to dismiss everything that is more complex than a meme. I tend to respond, if what I'm doing is mental gymnastics, if providing facts and reason argument is mental gymnastics, then what are you doing? Mental Special Olympics? What is this? This is I rarely, if ever, find an ex-Muslim who has intermediate level knowledge of the subject matter.
I actually went, before I took Shahada, when I was researching Islam, I figured that in order to do justice to this idea that I had of intellectual honesty, I had to go to who I thought would be the best critics of Islam. So I actually went onto the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain forum, and I basically wrote down that this was, before my Shahada, wrote down that I was a Muslim and why I converted to Islam. At this point, I was somewhat convinced that Islam was true, but I wanted to give the best arguments against the tradition that I could find. And I figured, well, if these people can't come up with an argument against Islam, then I don't know who will come up with an argument against Islam that is poignant enough to sort of dissuade me. So I went on, I wrote, it's still there probably, my post. I wrote a really long post about why I was Muslim, and I sat there and I watched the responses. And I don't think any of the responses were of the level that I expected. I certainly expected something a lot more thorough, addressing point by point. But what often happened was I was strawmanned in a lot of the responses. They would say, oh, you are religious because you think X, Y, Z. And a lot of those cop-out points about religious people, Tanzim's certainly very familiar with the points, and we all are very familiar with the points. Oh, you need someone to submit to. You don't like the idea of, no control, or you were disillusioned with something or other. You didn't have any friends. Some of them were even like you didn't belong to anything. But I was certainly very surprised by the lack of sort of weight and impact of the points that they made. Some of them certainly were slightly more knowledgeable about history and philosophy as well. But, a large swathe of them. And then the fact that you mentioned that they're kind of seen, I love the idea of the noble savage, by the way. That's one of my favorite ideas. And it's really interesting. But the idea that, they are taken to be experts on Islam in Western kind of discourse about Islam. And it's quite shocking to me. And it was shocking to me back then. So, you can imagine now.
Yeah, it frustrates me quite a bit, because I'm an ex-Christian and I'm an ex-secular liberal myself. But, nobody comes to me and, asks me for my advice about, or, what I think of Western values. Nobody interviews me regarding these things, or, takes my lived experience as evidence against, Western values. And, I wonder why. Well, I already know why, but, it's like, and it's very fascinating. And a lot of people are going to think that I'm bashing ex-Muslims, and I'm not really necessarily doing that. But those ex-Muslims who have this mentality that somehow they're superior to Muslims and that they know more, and they kind of, what's the word? They are accepting of the value that is given to them by many Westerners. They take advantage of it. For me, those individuals, they don't seem to realize something. And I hope if they're listening now that they hear this clearly. They were not given the position that they were given based on their own talents or their own intelligence. In fact, most of them that I've seen, especially the popular ones, are of average intelligence with little to no skill sets and little to no education. They were given the platforms they were given because they serve a purpose, and that's it.
I was going to just mention briefly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. I mean, I could keep saying a lot more. It offends people because they think I'm bashing them in that. And the other thing that's interesting, anytime I bring up these criticisms or I attack the personalities or the level of intelligence or level of knowledge of these individuals, I get attacked, saying, well, basically acting like I'm not supposed to do that because these people are being persecuted elsewhere or some other places. And it's as though ex-Muslims are immune from criticism. And it's ironic because the same people who promote ex-Muslims are the ones complaining about them not being able to criticize Islam or Muslims. And at the same time, these are individuals who are saying that we should fight against identity politics while they accept a sort of the same reasoning of identity politics when it comes to ex-Muslims. It's like, the same thing with like radical feminists, right? That you have to accept the testimony of a woman simply by virtue of her being a woman, right? By virtue of her lived experience. It's the same thing with ex-Muslims. Well, you have to accept what they say because they're ex-Muslims. Not because they have reason, argument, or evidence or anything. That who needs that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like subhanAllah, like we don't I think at the end of the day, it's all sectarianism, because my sort of experiences with atheists is that they had sort of bad experiences with Islam when they were younger. And what's happened with that is that they have taken on board, because they have had bad experiences, I don't know, with their parents talking about the deen or their imams or sheikhs or whatnot. They've automatically identified in their head that Islam is bad. So once they've gone down that route, they try to portray themselves as rational. So, they start to question all those easy things like, if God created everything, who created God? Ha ha ha. They think they're really smart. And then it sort of pushes them to be a certain way, which they think that, atheism is the way. But once they've, sort of grown and became older and stuff, they get, they get approached by, intellectual Muslims in the Muslim sphere. We know there's a lot of intellectual Muslims, right? And now it's all about sectarianism, because they've already identified themselves with atheism. They're not going to think about perhaps reconsidering things, if that makes sense. They're just going to hang with their own clique. Yeah. They're going to think and have very fixed stances on certain issues because of their sort of past histories or experiences with Islam. Because I know that there's going to be exceptions to the rule, obviously. And I actually want to talk to you about maybe like voodoo vids, for example, right? But everyone else, from my experiences, they always have this sub story to kind of bring to the table. And then it sort of goes from there. Then it's like, okay, look, this is what Islam does to us. Now let's fight against it, I guess. So
yeah. I agree. I mean, there are some exceptions, I suppose. That said, I mean, I think the exceptions are only within the realm of behavior, not so much the intellectual or knowledge level. I mean, like I said, I'm not saying that ex-Muslims in general don't understand Islam simply because I want to dismiss their arguments. No, the reason I say that is because every so-called ex-Muslim intellectual that exists right now has facile arguments. And they do not refer to academic source material. They do not refer to the breadth of the primary source material. They cherry pick just as badly as ISIS does. I mean, I'm just saying this objectively. If they had an argument, I would actually address it to some extent. I would do my best. But I have not once found an argument worthy of being called erudite. Of having any sort of scholarly, backing at all. It's all anecdote or just polemics, the size of a meme, like one sentence long argument, quote unquote. And it's just I am deeply, deeply disappointed.
I think one of the things I noticed very quickly when I was in the ex-Muslim forum was a lot of these people came from their parents were migrants from the subcontinent and from the Middle East. And many of them a lot of them actually came from village backgrounds and working class backgrounds in these countries. And it's like, well, just because you were given some shubuhat by, the secular tradition, that your, village parents who probably migrated to the West to get to work and they've spent their whole life working to provide your education since, couldn't answer, doesn't mean that Islam doesn't have the answers. And it's something that Imam Zaid Shakir actually mentioned in a talk. He said that whenever I meet ex-Muslims, I say, oh, well, have you read Al-Ghazali? Have you read Fakhruddin Razi? And they go, no.
No, I watched Zakir Naik.
No. That's yeah.
They don't watch
Zakir Naik, but
they just look at his videos so they can make fun of stuff. That's it. And I agree. Shakir was correct in his analysis, and then likewise with myself. And the general excuse is that I don't need to look at this because it's too long and complex. TLDR, therefore it's wrong, which is fallacious nonsense. If you want to attack Islam, if you want to critique Islam, then you should do so by steel manning it, by going after its strongest arguments, to its greatest intellectuals, and criticizing them the best you can. But generally that's not the case. They always go for low hanging fruit. And this is also why you never find any ex-Muslims, quote unquote, intellectuals or popular ex-Muslims debating Muslims. I've challenged several on many occasions, only to be ignored or have the debates reneged on because of quote unquote security reasons. Apparently I'm very dangerous.
I see that a lot on YouTube comments of you. Yeah,
and every time I've tried to challenge and others have tried to challenge them, people who have actually studied the subject at, an academic level, they scurry away. Because the thing is, well, it serves two advantages. One, it's advantageous because obviously they don't know what they're talking about. They don't want to be humiliated on stage. And secondly, it's advantageous because they can continue. And I think this is the most important advantage for them, is that I don't think a lot of people realize this, but if they actually have an academic debate with a Muslim, what that does is it without even the Muslim saying anything, it completely undermines their narrative, because their narrative is to constantly victimize themselves by suggesting that they are always under the threat of death. Right. So if you have a Muslim sitting there having an academic discussion with them, showing no signs of hurting them or anything, and you have a Muslim audience that has no signs of hurting them or anything, then it completely undermines their presentation, their narrative. Because it showcases that Muslims, in fact, do want to have discussions, right? But now, the narrative from many ex-Muslims is that Muslims don't want to have discussions because they're all, we're all rabid, foaming at the mouth, want to kill them.
Well,
it certainly plays against the narrative that they're trying to.
Yeah, so they can't have debates with us because it proves them wrong immediately.
And I feel that what they latch onto when it comes to Islam is those things that can kind of make people emotionally wary of. Like, for example, just be something to do with hellfire. Oh, why does a merciful God allow for hellfire to exist?
Yeah.
But, we know from our point of view that it's not like he's just going to be what do you call it?
Yeah, Allah is just. The idea that justice outweighs.
Yeah, they sort of portray God in their own mind and sort of project that onto others.
Well, Sayyid Nursi once said, Bediüzzaman Zaman Sayyid Nursi, that how we view God is a reflection of ourselves.
Our projection of it anthropomorphize God in many ways. I see that quite a bit, especially even among atheists in general. That said, I do want to. There's so much that we can discuss regarding the behavior and the attitude and the general intellectual level of these people. That said, I think that it'd be good to bring up some examples as to, some of the things that I've run into personally. I can give just a few off the top of my head right now. So I don't know if you've noticed this, but that hadith that's typically cited from Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari regarding what the Prophet, peace be upon him, stated very clearly. I've been commanded to fight the people until they say La ilaha illallah. Right. I'm sure you're familiar with that hadith.
Yeah, it's my favorite hadith.
Yeah, so yeah, the one that's typically cited to say, oh, Muslims are commanded to go around and, since they have to follow the Sunnah, we have to go kill everyone until they convert to Islam. What's ironic about that is that these same ex-Muslims who tend to cite this hadith in support of that narrative also believe in the dhimmi contract, or believe that Muslims who pay the jizya, etc., are exempt from this, right? So there's an inconsistency there, which showcases that they're not really interested in reading comprehension or integrity. Because if you actually read the hadith, you'll notice when he says the people, that's not a universal declaration of all humanity. That's obviously must be about a specific group of people, because it can't apply to everyone, obviously, because there are other conditions, right, which are admitted by the ex-Muslims themselves. So when you look at other hadith, and this is where we come into the research aspect, you find that the people is actually referring specifically to the Arab polytheist, right? Because there are another hadith where it states that I've been commanded to fight the mushrikeen, the Arab polytheist, so that they can say La ilaha illallah, right? But you see these inconsistencies. And then there's other inconsistencies, like when I was discussing with Vito Vids, I'm sure you saw this part of the discussion. And when I was speaking with Armin Navabi and others, where I bring up the whole thing about, lashing or a punishment for adultery. Right? A lot of ex-Muslims don't know this, but the punishment is only for if somebody performs the act in public, right? Yeah. But in a lot of ex-Muslims' minds, they always go around claiming, oh, no, this punishment is for people who do it in the privacy of their own homes. It's like, no, that's not the case, because if you knew anything about Islamic law, even the basics, you would know that it's impermissible for the government to enter your premises without your permission. That's why you need 4 witnesses, and that's why video evidence is not admissible in court, because it's considered spying.
Yeah, exactly.
Right now, and this is just general. These are just some examples that I bring up. This is not even intermediate level stuff. This is like basic things, And then when I always hear from the ex-Muslims, like Vito's like, "Oh, I didn't know that." I was like, "Well, why?" I don't get it.
I feel like they're sort of in their own worldview. Like, for example, like you brought up the example of fornication and not doing it in the private sphere versus the public sphere, and the punishment for that. I think that even like taking that argument into consideration, the fact that they sort of live in the liberal secular society, they've made it the norm that sexual promiscuity should be okay, right? So they're sort of under an assumption, and then they try to go against Islam, saying, look, why do you have that ruling? If that makes sense.
Even more than that, one thing I noticed on the forum was there was actually a discussion about how sexually repressive Islam was, and they were actually saying, why can't Islam be sexually open, like religions like Buddhism and Hinduism? And I was literally sitting there, I'm like, correct me if I'm wrong, but Buddhist monks are celibate. Like the whole point of they're supposed to, not all of them, but it's considered, I think in Tibetan Buddhism, it's considered a praiseworthy thing to repress any form of sexual desire and not express it at all. And I just sat there and I'm like, do these people, like, it's almost the projection of everything that's bad,
liberalism
it's ironic too, because like a couple minutes later there's going to be another thread in that forum that says that Islam is all about sex, because the huris in Jannah. So it's like you can't win, right?
Exactly. You mentioned video vids, and that was something really interesting. I used to watch his videos quite a bit with me and my wife would sit there and watch them. And my wife is also from a subcontinental background, as is Vidu, and we were sitting there watching the video about how he had, and we were wondering, because he's quite an articulate guy, he's quite he has a lot of Muslims on in his channel, and we really wanted to talk about I really wanted to get to the bottom of why he apostatized and his kind of worldview. I really wanted to know. And one of the things he said one day just really highlighted everything for me perfectly. And it goes back to the idea you mentioned before of the noble savage. So when the colonizers came, there would be a select few amongst the colonized people who would adopt the ways of the Westerner, or would be sufficiently Western that they would give some kind of tacit approval and recognition of this. So Vidu said something one day, and I hope he listens to this. Shout out to VideoVids. I'll see if I can send it to his YouTube.
Just spam on the comment section.
Yeah. The one thing he said, because Ali Dawa made a pretty good video, I think, about ex-Muslims. And one thing he said was a lot of them have that colonized mindset of we have to become like the white man. And Vidu sat there with a complete straight face. And I was there with my wife. He said, I don't see the white man, quote unquote, the white man as superior. Ali Dawa is the colonized man for seeing them as his masters. I say the white man and the British people are all my equals. And we both, me and my wife just looked at each other and we just burst out laughing.
Yeah, okay.
Because I'm like, do you think that they will ever see you as completely equal to them? Even if you strip yourself entirely of your Islam and your beliefs, do you think that they will ever look at you and be like, you know what, you're 100% Western now? You will always be subject to the same stereotypes, the same ideas.
Yeah, like Majid Nawaz got wrecked a few weeks ago.
Yeah, 100%.
Because of. It's ironic because he sides with the white people, but then next minute he gets bashed up by a white person.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's always going to be there, regardless.
And it's not so much, and I want to be clear here about the word white that's being used, because I know a lot of people are going to pick at it. But when we're speaking about white man's burden, yes, it did have racial connotations in the past, but when especially academics mention white man's burden, it refers specifically to European and American culture or Western culture in general. The mentality of Western culture. Of course, the racial term is still there, but it no longer has that connotation. So I just want to be clear on that end, because it's not the race that's being attacked there; it's the cultural mentality. So I just want to make that clear to your.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction to make. Yeah. It's kind of like we say we intend that to be implicit in what we're saying. However,
most people, some people may.
Yeah, some people may not take it that way. Well, I mean, is your background Iberian, by the way? I guess from your name, Al-Andalusi, that you might have...
I'm a pure-blood Spaniard.
So. Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
¿Hablas español?
Un poquito, because I was born and raised in the U.S., so...
Yeah. Well, no, my dad's family come from Italy, so southern Italy. So we both actually come from lands, for listeners who don't know, that were originally occupied by Muslims, and
I wouldn't say occupied,
and actually not occupied. Yeah, that's a really bad word to use in this context. After our colonialism discussion,
there was nothing to occupy because all the opposing military ran away.
Exactly.
And all the people
absorbed into the Muslim empire and spheres of influence. We'll say,
and it's interesting because a lot of people like to today they like to anachronistically look back on Muslim history and suggest that we were colonizers and etc. But it's like the word colonization is a very recent term, and it really was meant for more a version of imperialism that had not yet been seen in history, at least on a normative level. A lot of people don't realize this, but what colonizers essentially did was they not only invaded a land, but they typically committed genocide, and they typically tried to completely change the cultures of the individuals that were living, the natives that were living there. Or, and they would completely exploit those individuals and take their resources. Whereas with the Muslims, really what Muslims did was that they moved into a land, they lived there, they had their own laws, and let everyone else have their own laws as long as they had their own, paid tax. And that was it. That was really it. There was no attempt to commit genocide or get rid of everyone else's religion or cultures. That was not the intention. But with the colonizers, that generally was the case.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you, by the way. Imtiaz Shams, who's a fairly big ex-Muslim in Britain as well.
He came to Sydney last year.
He actually said...
And Harris Sultan, I know you know him really well.
I don't know him very well. I do know that he's a troll.
Yeah, hello.
No, Imtiaz Shams actually said that he gave his speech about how Islam was a colonizing force in that the lands that it absorbed adopted the Arabic alphabet. And adopted, Middle Eastern style dress. A lot of people would say that the subcontinent, the idea of how people dress on the subcontinent, is influenced by, basically the Arab Muslims and the Persian Muslims who came across. But yeah, what would you say to that ridiculous. Specifically, the idea of Islam as a colonizing force? Well,
first off, like I said, it's anachronistic thinking, indicative of an individual who lacks critical thinking in general. I've had many run-ins with Imtiaz. He's not exactly the sharpest tool in the box. That said, for example, one of the things that is often neglected is how people dressed in general in the past. So, for example, the hijab was a normative form of clothing for many civilizations, even prior to Islam coming into the picture. So, for example, the Byzantine women tended to veil themselves prior to Muslims or getting that command. Likewise, the thobe, the long dress that men wear in the Middle East, was also adopted by the Romans and the Persians in many instances. Not all the time, but that was also a cultural element. So when even the early Muslims themselves, when they conquered Byzantine cities, there are certain excerpts within the Ars history which show that when they came back, they were wearing Roman clothing, right? And the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the companion, they were fine with it, generally speaking. So, I mean, the idea that there was like this drastic change, of adopting the dominant culture is like, that's kind of ludicrous if you think about it, because those changes were not as significant as you'd see today. In actuality, most people dressed very similar in antiquity. So it wasn't like it wasn't abnormal, for example, for a woman to put a headscarf on in most places, So the idea that cultural appropriation was a major thing is like, that's nonsense for one. Yes, a language was adopted, but typically for more pragmatic reasons. It wasn't enforced. So, for example, when the leading universities were speaking Arabic, then obviously people learned Arabic, so they can get an education. You know what I mean? So things like that. But I wouldn't say it wasn't enforced upon the populations. I mean, the Jews were still Jews. They had a very lively culture. They had their own legal systems, etc. The Christians still had their own legal systems. They could eat their own foods, etc. So there was no incentive for them to do so unless they wanted to come closer to the political circles, or they needed to use the language or certain forms of dress in order to, to get something of their own needs or desires. So yeah, there was never like some, government level enforcement of these things. That's nonsense.
We were mentioning about some ex-Muslims in general, because I've followed your stuff, and you had big dialogues with the apostate prophet, for example.
I haven't had dialogue.
You went on this like back and forth.
Yeah, I've had back.
A lot of
so.
You made a whole video on how he got reported. Oh, how you reported him to was it the Feds,
CIA,
CIA
I
or something?
him to the FBI. Yeah.
So that's pretty funny.
Why did you report him to the FBI?
Because he thought it was a good idea to openly admit on camera that he used to be part of a terrorist organization in Turkey. That was pretty idiotic. And he tried to point that as a he just
fact,
immigrated to my country a year ago, and I think that the Fed should know about that. So
yeah, and he actually said that the Feds visited him as well.
Yeah,
he blamed
he made this really
for it.
ridiculous story that they sided with him and now they're investigating me. It's like, yeah, that didn't happen. I'm sorry. That's not what happened.
But yeah, like you've had dialogues with him, and you went on the secular jihadist podcast show,
yep.
Ali Rizvi and them, and you dialogue with other people as well. Yep. People would say that leave them in their own corner. Why bother giving them a platform, or why bother talking with them, because they're ex-Muslims and they should be in their own sort of bubble. And what would your response be to that? Because you obviously directly engage with them in dialogue.
Well, I think that I know there are certain Muslims out there who are saying that we should put our heads in the sand and just ignore them. And I think that's a nonsensical take. I think that's something that it's just ludicrous. I mean, there's no reason that we should be ignoring them at all. Yes, they are insignificant in many ways. However, they are being used as a tool, as the primary means to attack Islam. And by undermining them, by undermining their arguments and showcasing the Muslim position to be stronger, we are also undermining the Islamophobe movement. Simply ignoring it is not going to make it go away. We've been doing that for quite some time, actually, prior to this. And that's one of the main reasons that they were able to grow to a significant level, both in the general population, online, and even in politics, is because Muslims have been burying their heads in the sand and saying, "Oh, it's just going to go away if we just ignore them." And by ignoring them, what we have essentially done as well is we've given legitimacy to their arguments because we haven't made any responses to them. And, the thing is, and this is not how the traditional scholars acted at all. Even if a group was insignificant, they would still respond to it to some degree so that people would not get the impression that there was no response. Because they understood that, if you plant a seed, it will grow eventually, but, if you don't allow the seed to grow, then all the better for it. So traditional scholars, even, Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah and even Imam Shatibi, they would address things that you would consider insignificant, or they would consider insignificant back then even, but they would still address it because they felt that it was necessary for those few people who might be convinced, and for the future, just in case people would be like, oh, nobody's made a response, therefore they must be right. So I think it's not only ludicrous, but I think it's dangerous to suggest that we should just ignore all these problems. And for the longest time, Al-Azhar University, their main response to atheism, or the rise of atheism in the Muslim world, was to ignore it. And that was a horrible mistake on their part.
Yeah, that's the problem when we sort of leave them to be. If they grow in influence and power, and we see that through, even in media circles, they're getting proper airtime nowadays. It's crazy. And not only that, we know in the Muslim tradition, even contemporary Muslim scholars and thinkers, we have the intellectual capacity to engage with the ideas. But what happens is that if you leave them to be, firstly, they get all the platforms, and we're sort of stuck. We're like, we should have, guys like yourself. We've got other people we had on our podcast, like, I don't know, like, for example, Dr. Shadi al-Masri and stuff. We should be getting all their opinions out there, but because, unfortunately what the media have done, have taken on board the ex-Muslim story, the sob story, and sort of given weight to it. Now it's really influencing the masses, especially people who have not, who don't really know the deen or know Islam. They sort of get the first impressions of, it's these ex-Muslims that have bad histories, and look at what Islam does. So unfortunately, we're in a bit of a pickle, to say the least. Because of this.
My mum very rarely kind of dialogues with me about things to do with Islam. She never asks, it's very rare that she'll come up and ask me questions about Islam, about Muslims in the world. But one of the times she actually came and asked me and wanted to have a discussion with me was when, I don't know if you know about Rafael.
Yes.
She was a Saudi Arabian woman who tried to seek asylum in Australia. She'd renounced Islam and felt that her life was threatened. And my mum she said that the thing she said was not, why is Islam doing this, or why are Muslims perpetuating this, like, why does this religion, basically, it's so evil, it's so backward. That wasn't my mum's point. My mum said, why is it that Muslims haven't come out and explained what the situation with Rahaf is? Why isn't it that why haven't I heard the other side of this thing? And I think I said to her, I think a lot of it has to do with media coverage.
That's one.
I think that sensationalized media doesn't want to give a fair and balanced account of anything to do with Islam whatsoever. But secondly, I think that's certainly that's a case there, that why aren't we there every time something happens? Not just saying, oh no, what happened is not Islam, but the actual points made, be like, this is an injustice that is done. Islam does not promote XYZ. Saudi Arabia is XYZ. And distinguishing between what is traditional Islam and what is correct kind of implementation of these principles, because it was certainly wrong what had happened to her. I mean, she had, as she claimed, if what she claimed is true, the idea that she had death squads, like a vigilante death squad, coming for her is certainly not an Islamic idea.
Yeah, and I think that there's two, and I agree with you that there are two issues here. One of them is media coverage, and that's also something else that a lot of Muslims don't seem to understand, is that you also often hear the excuse that we need to ignore these people because we're giving them more attention. It's like, well, they've already got enough attention, because the mainstream media is giving them more attention than they're giving us. So we have to raise our voices somehow. If we keep ignoring it, then we'll just be silenced even further. We're not getting enough platforms to counter them. We're not being given a fair platform to counter them. So we have to keep speaking up as much as possible. It's easy to get attention as an ex-Muslim. You just simply have to announce it. You don't have to have any credentials. You can come from a backwards village in the middle of nowhere, and they'll consider you a scholar, right? But for us, it's like we have to shout louder. So just simply ignoring it's not going to help. And I agree, that the other side, the Muslims, aren't helping by continuously pushing this narrative that if we ignore them, they'll go away. This is obviously a delusional perspective, and I'm sorry to say that, to be rude, but it's a delusional perspective. It's outside the bounds of reality. If you look at how things are operating today, silence is not an option.
Like the Saudi girl, imagine that like a country is willing to give her asylum. There's like literally people in Syria, Yemen who are like dying on the street, and they're getting attacked in waves. And they don't give them a day, time of day. But then this girl that's just like, Saudi Arabia, this is what they're doing to me, and she gets asylum because of that, because of the reason of painting the picture of she's an ex-Muslim and Islam is doing this to me, over the fact that people are dying on the streets in all the countries in the world, like in Syria and the Middle East. It goes to show how much of a role that
in the end we didn't actually grant her asylum.
Yeah, but she went to the other.
She went to Canada.
Yeah.
But
even that, like, Canada's like an influential country. So
if you think about it too, like let's just say that her story is true, right? But one of the things that really made me angry about this individual, I sympathize with her plight. I wrote a whole post about it too on my Facebook regarding this whole situation, and I sympathize with her plight. If it was true. That said, there were some things about her story that really kind of anger me because her attitude angered me. And what I mean to say is that, I don't know if you're aware of this, but prior to going to Australia, where she wanted to seek asylum, she's decided to stop off in Thailand first for a little vacation. That's the reason she was in Thailand. It wasn't because she was actually going there to, transfer her flight. She wanted to stay in Thailand for a bit to see the sights. It's like if you're escaping from a danger, why would you? What kind of mentality is that? And then likewise, she didn't seem to be. Another thing that really made me angry about her was that she didn't seem to be considerate of the fact that there were other people who were waiting before her, who are in desperate situation, who are literally dying as we speak. And she didn't seem to give one, care in the world for those people. She didn't even announce it. She was all about herself, which indicates to me that she's a spoiled brat. And I'm sorry if it offends a lot of people, but
no,
honestly, it's like if I was in that situation and I was blessed with the opportunity to be granted asylum, one of the first things I would say is not only thank you, but what about the other people that deserve it?
Yeah, of course.
So to me, it shows that she's a selfish individual, and I'm sure she's going to exploit this.
I wanted to ask you, kind of going slightly off topic, but
yeah,
you see ex-Muslims talk about their situation, or they have death threats and whatnot, but at the same time they're willing to bring up topics like why does Allah have created hellfire. They sort of bring the idea that Allah has to be merciful and stuff, and with those sort of, when they talk about that, they try to portray that they're sort of very upright and moral people, and the injustices are doing to them, right? But at the same time, I feel that they overlook situations such as things in the Middle East. They don't really talk about it, they don't really engage with it. They don't really want to give, time of day to those sort of situations. They don't speak about it as well. If they really cared, they would be talking about it openly, right? But I feel that because the most of the Middle East is they're Muslim, they sort of shut it down and try to emphasize, injustices in other areas. But what's your sort of take on that? Do you think they actually have an idea of morality, or they're just playing, a certain narrative to suit their agenda, if that makes sense?
Well, I think that they're, if you're talking about hellfire or morality in general, or
just, I would say morality in general. Like, I just brought the hellfire example up just to show that they try to portray that, if they were God, for example, they wouldn't do such a situation because they're so just and moral and upright, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it's nonsense. And I think it's also very facile arguments. I mean, if you look at many of their arguments, they simply borrow from polemics they find online. And they don't really think about these things in depth, because most of these ex-Muslims, especially atheists too, when you ask them about their skepticism, the reality is their skepticism only goes as far as religion. It never goes where it should go, which is themselves. They're never skeptical of their own opinions or their own doubts or anything of that sort. And that's that's why it's very easy to undermine their arguments, because they haven't thought about them or try to be consistent in this respect. So, for example, with the whole issue of hellfire, it's interesting. I always see a lot of experts say, well, I would never punish anyone for eternity, or blah, blah, blah. I'd be more merciful, et cetera, et cetera. And their understanding of mercy is quite juvenile, if you look at it. So, first off, to clarify the Islamic position is that, by the majority, is that hellfire is eternal. However, the reason for that is because the action that is being performed, the thing that is being punished, is also being done eternally. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in several places in the Quran, the Quran explicates that the kuffar, the people who reject God, are not only knowledgeable of God's existence and of the truth in general, but that they arrogantly dismiss it based on their own desires. So, for example, when faced with hellfire, there are numerous passages in the Quran where they're faced with hellfire and they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send them back so that they can perform good deeds and then come back and enter Jannah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds and says, I know that you're lying. I know that when you go back, you're just going to continue doing what you're doing. And this is just an excuse. So in reality, the reason for hellfire is quite explicit in the Quran, in that these individuals refuse to submit to Allah. They refuse to follow Islam. And there are other places also where this is evident. For example, Iblis is mentioned as the first kafir. I don't know if most people don't know this, but he's actually said that when he refuses to submit, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands him to bow to Adam, alayhi salam, he basically, he says no. Obviously, he denies, he doesn't want to do it, and then Allah responds and says, "You are among the disbelievers." Right. So he calls Iblis, Shaitan, a disbeliever, even though Shaitan is very much aware of Allah's existence and very much aware of the truth. So that's one thing that needs to be clarified. A lot of Muslims don't know that, a lot of ex-Muslims especially. That said, one of the things that I find about this notion of mercy that a lot of ex-Muslims think they have, and justice, they believe mercy is forgiving regardless of an individual wanting to repent or feeling guilty for their sins. And this is where you find the morality is very shallow. For them, Allah has to forgive everyone, even if that person does not want to submit to the truth or be guilty or feel guilty in the slightest. Like, that person's like, yeah, I murdered thousands of people, but it's cool. You have to forgive me. And the ex-Muslim's like, yeah, you have to forgive him because you're merciful. And that's not to say, of course, that even if that person feels guilty, that you can't punish them. But what the point I'm trying to make here is that for many ex-Muslims and atheists in general, what they think about mercy, they think that that person needs to be forgiven regardless, without any conditions. But that's not what mercy is. That is something else. That is called stupidity. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that I'm a judge, just a human judge, obviously, and I'm looking over a case, and I have a repeat offender, maybe somebody who's stolen several times, right? And every time they come to court, they say, I don't care that I did it, and I'm happy that I did it, right? And I continue to forgive them, right? I keep saying, okay, go on your way and don't do it again. And they keep doing it and coming back and coming back. Eventually, my mercy is not going to look like mercy. It's going to look like I'm complicit in that person's crimes, right? Because I'm still letting them go. I'm not punishing them. I'm never letting them pay for their crimes. I'm being merciful, right? But that's, like I said, that's not mercy. That's stupidity. That's complicity in somebody else's immorality. So when I always hear these arguments, I see them as very facile, because if you really think about it, what they're asking for is Allah to be complicit in other people's rebellion against God. And how can Allah do that? That's like denying himself.
Yes,
I don't know. Was that too lengthy of an answer? I was just trying to.
No, that was definitely it hit the point home. And it's like, for example, the will to disbelieve for the disbelievers is eternity. Like, you can give them 1,000,000 years. It doesn't, like, people are like, oh, it's such, 80 years. Why is Allah punishing them for so long? Like, give them 1,000,000 years, they'll still disbelieve. So why would you still give them 1,000,000 years if they're still going to be the same even after 80 years? You know what I mean? So Allah's punishing for the fact that their will to disbelieve is, forever, essentially, right? It's different for some people who might be, they're a bit confused, this and that. Allah judges, I guess there'll be exceptions to the rule. I don't know. But I'm saying for the most part, if someone like has a will to disbelieve, they're going to do it forever. So that's why Allah's punishing them for eternity. So, and in the idea of, in terms of being merciful, like, Allah isn't going to be, all loving all the time, like you're saying. Like, it's not like they're, what do you call it? Something love, compromise.
Unconditional.
Yeah, unconditional love. It's not unconditional. That's like being, how this might be a bad example, not as halal, but some girl, some guy likes a girl, and the guy is just like head over heels for her. It doesn't matter how she treats him. He's still loving her and everything, right? That's like, why would Allah do that? That's pretty much like what you're saying is Allah should be, doing unconditional love regardless of anything that happens. If anything, it should be Muslims or believers of God that should be doing unconditional love for God, regardless of what happens. Not the other way around. Like, not God saying, yeah, it's all right if you can disbelieve this and that. Like, I don't know, if you really break it down for them, it falls flat on the face.
The way that I always like to remember it for myself, and this puts it in perspective for me, is that it's in my hands, in a sense. Not that my fate is in my hands, but you will not be assigned a fate which you did not earn. That is a promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, you will receive what you earned in this life. So in that sense, the decisions that I make regarding the state that I will die in will result in the state I am assigned for eternity. That's the understanding that I always remember. But we never think of it, and ex-Muslims never portray it as the sense that you have some control over what awaits you.
Yeah.
Post, after you in the afterlife.
They follow it up to, like, once you kind of clarify these things to them, they follow it up and saying, well, if God's all merciful, why does he continue to punish these people? Why doesn't he just kill them off, or make them extinct? Right? Why does he let them continue to oppose him, knowing that they're never going to reform? Right? And it would seem like a legitimate question until you also analyze that more in depth, and you realize that that's nonsense, because that's a violation of their free will. If God has to go out of his way to force people, or refuse them the choice, then in what way is he acting mercifully? In what way is he able to exhibit mercy if the individual is no longer existing to receive it, or to potentially receive that mercy? Smaller. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's like, okay, well, why did he make these people to begin with? Well, if he didn't make these people, then how could his mercy be manifest to humanity or known to humanity? Right? Does that make sense? It's like,
nothing would be known to humanity.
You're removing the very object of where his mercy would be going by refusing them the right to live.
Like, he has the ability to be merciful, obviously, but it's about putting it in action is where you're talking about. That's where creation needs to exist in order for that to manifest in creation, essentially. Yeah. That's what I'm getting at.
And essentially, like I said, it all boils down to and my way of sort of figuring out what is a more rational position to take is to see which one is more absurd. Right. So when you look at the ex-Muslim position on mercy, or the atheist general understanding of mercy, their version of mercy is very juvenile. It comes in an unconditional way, where it becomes basically complicity in immorality. And that is not a God that I can believe in, because that's a God that's not just.
Like you compare the pair, like, there's Islam with all these arguments and stuff, but what do the atheists bring to the table? Like, it's so easy to be skeptic, like to just point out something and be like, yo, why does Islam say this and that? But what are you bringing to the table? Like, what's my whole idea is like, I think there was a famous saying by a scholar, I forgot, but he said that, Islam builds palaces, and, atheism or the secular liberal West tries to tear it down. That's literally it. Like, that's all they do. Like they don't build anything.
They don't have
if
anything.
that makes sense.
And that's the thing that a lot of people don't seem to understand, especially a lot of young Muslims these days, is that there is no good alternatives coming from the atheist camp or even the ex-Muslim camp. In general, it's a lot of like very facile arguments that just conforms to the Western hegemony. You know, it's basically like, well, you believe in human rights. And it's like, okay, well, and then of course, you know, they never question the validity of human rights themselves. And I'm not trying to say necessarily undermine that right now. What I'm trying to say is that they never applied the same standards that they applied to religion, in Islam specifically, to their own beliefs. So, for example, when it comes to, you need to prove Islam scientifically. Okay, well, what about human rights? You know, why? And they're like, well, no, you don't need to do that. Right. And they generally always try to support their positions differently, you know, through a different means, different standard. And it's interesting because, you know, human rights is a human construct without any transcendent value. If you don't appeal to God, then human rights, there's no such thing as human rights in reality. That's just something that we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel better. It's a human construct.
It's
you know.
And yeah, subhanAllah, like you're just born into an era that just happened to have all these rules and regulation. You're just going with the status quo. That's literally what it is. Like really random rules. Like it could be something completely different. Yeah. But why do you choose to go by this? Like, and using those kind of principles, you try to refute religions. That doesn't make any sense. Like where's your standard or criteria coming from? It's coming from wherever you. Yeah.
I agree. And that's the problem. You know, they never look at their own beliefs. They take this dogmatic, skeptical approach towards everything else but themselves and their own perspectives. But when you apply everything consistently, you find that atheists are generally without any substance, and ex-Muslims particularly, because all they're doing is conforming to the dominant standards of the time. And it's ironic, too, because they're the ones calling themselves free thinkers.
SubhanAllah. I did a post on my own Facebook a while back. It got a bit of heat because Muslims weren't commenting the best of things under it, but the whole idea of the post I made was that I had a dialogue with the ex-Muslim, and he was talking about the idea of, you know, believing in God ends up being, you know, sort of a faith or a leap of faith. I'm like, if you want to take it to that extreme, fine, you can do that. That's not an issue. Like, but why do you not put the same standards in place when you go about life? For example, you know, when you visit a doctor, you know, you just assuming they're a doctor, a legitimate doctor. Why aren't you skeptic then? Why aren't you, like, you know, it's, if you're going into a surgery, very important surgery, why you just, you know, take a leap of faith then? But when it comes to God, you're putting all these like weird as sort of reasonings in place for, oh yeah, you know, leap of faith, this and that, but you don't do it for everything else in your life. It makes no sense. Like even for, you know, your mother being your mother, you know, like, well, you have good reasons, right? Just as you,
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I think
it's all good.
Analogies can be problematic for a number of reasons. In that, you know, we have standards of credibility for people that we know that, you know, we can actually analyze. You know, let me put it this way. There are certain things that require empirical verification, and then there are things that do not. And because human understanding of the world is very holistic. So, for example, when it comes to morality, we don't need empirical evidence for that. We need to understand that there are moral principles in the world for humanity to function. Likewise, the concept of God is very much intrinsic to human beings, a very natural tendency. And likewise, believing that reality itself exists. So, you know, one of the examples I like to bring up, not the doctor one or the one the mother's, you know, who do you know, if your mother had a mother, things like that. Although that does take some leap of faith. I think a stronger example is, imagine you're walking outside, or, you know, just like every other day, and you see a tree, right? And you have the same tree in your front yard or on the street corner or whatever. And you know, you assume it's a tree because it looks like a tree, right? There's no reason for you to doubt the existence of that tree or to think that it's nothing but a tree. And to force that skepticism onto yourself basically makes you dysfunctional in the world. If you walk outside every day and you go, you know, I don't know if this is real or not, you're not going to be able to operate as a person. Like you're not going to be able to go outside because you have to consistently prove everything that you come across. And in reality, human beings, you know, maybe this goes into a different discussion now with regard to skepticism and doubt, but doubt and skepticism are natural tendencies only when human beings experience what we call an anomaly, or a something that goes against the norm. But normally, human beings are quote unquote gullible creatures. We have to be in order to function in the world. Things have to appear as they are to us in our minds for us to actually operate. If we are constantly skeptical of everything we see and everything that we experience, then in reality, we can't do anything. We can't make the first step at all. We have to have some certain ground assumptions, pragmatically speaking, in order to even comprehend anything at all. Right. So proving everything just leads down a rabbit hole that you'll never be able to escape from.
I think Imam Ghazali talked about this, and he also explained how when he went through extreme skepticism, he went legitimately sick. And I think this is in Deliverance from Error. He said that when he went down that rabbit hole of just skepticism, when he got like severely sick, I think Allah threw a light into his heart, and that's kind of like evidence of itself that I think he was trying to portray the idea of belief in God through that manner, and how skepticism will actually, it's an unhealthy state. You know what I mean? And in regards to your previous idea of rationality around you, like you just have to kind of take things as face value, like when you go outside and look at a tree and stuff. I think Imam Ghazali also mentioned this in Deliverance from Error, where he said that because in the past a lot of the Greek philosophers were into the senses. They were like, you should interpret the world around using your senses, and then the rationalists kind of came along and said that no, it's deceptive, like just because you see the sun go around in a certain way with your senses does not mean that's what actually happens. And on top of that, then Imam Ghazali makes a point that so your rationality tries to sort of cancel out your senses, but what's not to say that there is a faculty that exists that cancels out your rationality that we just haven't experienced, right? So that's actually a pretty powerful point, because if you think about it, you're actually relying on the human self to come up with these, logical conclusions, all that sort of stuff. But we know through revelation, it actually, to some degree, what Allah sees actually cancels out what we perceive to be as rational, if that makes sense.
There's a really interesting story where he saw a snake, a magician, I think, or a snake charmer or something, and he had a stick, like a staff. Ghazali was witnessing this man with a staff, and he said, I'm going to turn this staff into a snake. And surely enough, it was a magic trick, like a illusion. And he put the staff on the ground, and sure enough, there was a snake. And Ghazali said that at that point, he realized that his senses were so incredibly fallible as a means of understanding reality that he could never rely on them to deduce what is necessarily true solely on that, because he saw how quickly and how easily he could be deceived by just a common man doing a trick. And so it's like, how can you then, if you can't even tell the difference between how a man makes a stick look like a snake, how are you meant to work out the fundamental truths of existence through your senses? That's
yeah, it's an axiom. Like one of the atheists, I don't know, like for example, like David Hume, you're making an assumption that you can find everything out through your senses. Like that's all you go by as, like, I guess an atheist, you have to kind of be on an axiom that rationality will sort of get you a truth.
We're always criticized by atheists as well for accepting authentic testimony as a means of understanding things. But it's like, I was talking to Dan Hageman, for those who are in the Sydney scene.
He give a quick lowdown, because a lot of people won't know him.
Dan Hageman is a sort of student of Sam Harris. Not a student, but it is, a big fan of Sam Harris, and he seeks to kind of give Sam Harris's dawah in a university setting, particularly to Muslim and Christian societies. He's an ex-evangelical Christian. He's very interested in neuroscience, and I think he's doing a PhD in philosophy. He's actually
American, but he lives in Sydney, so he's done debates. He's done like with Uthman Badr for our local listeners.
He's actually a pretty good
argumentator.
He's a very good. His discourses are quite a good level, in the sense that
Badr.
He actually. He has very good
Uthman Badr. Yeah.
He has very good adab, Dan Hageman, and he also gives a point of charity. So he won't straw man your arguments and then try to knock them down. But one thing that he's very critical of is the idea that religion is a the idea of authentic testimony. It's like you can't really authenticate any testimony. But I just sat there for a while and I thought, he believes that basically human beings have no free will whatsoever, and he says that Sam Harris did an experiment using EEGs, I think, and he proved basically that human beings have no free will. I asked if anyone has any questions. I think they should get in contact with someone who can explain the refutation of Sam Harris in this light a lot better than I. And one man who I spoke to was Dr. Muhammad Gilan.
Yeah,
he's a neuroscientist, a PhD in neuroscience. He knows a lot. Yeah, he knows a lot about this particular argument. I think he may have actually responded to it on the podcast. But one of the things I thought about is Dan Hageman was not present at Sam Harris's conducting of the experiment. He relies entirely on Sam Harris's results being portrayed correctly by him. So the fact that he didn't fabricate it. So he is of the belief that Sam Harris is a trustworthy person because he did not witness the experiment. So he's actually done all the things that we would do to verify the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but for Sam Harris. And on top of that,
atheist transmission.
You don't even know that whether Sam Harris, whether that experiment actually indicates free will. He's making that leap of faith that what Sam Harris proved was the idea of consciousness and free will, because Sam Harris didn't actually forgive me. Sam Harris didn't actually prove that what he showed. Basically, it was something like he put them in a certain situation, and he measured the fact that certain parts of their brain responded to that situation before the aspect of the brain that controls and decides was activated. So basically, your action precedes your decision in a lot of cases. But he said that what was found on the charts or on the EEG, I think, was not consciousness. This was the argument of Dr. Muhammad Gilan, that it was just, your natural reaction. It didn't necessarily indicate the action that you were the decision that you were gonna make. It was just like, if I put a flashing light in front of you, your brain's gonna react a certain way. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that you're gonna necessarily choose to run away or choose to punch the person in the face, but it just shows that your brain is going to react in a certain way. Anyway, he accepts the fact that Dan Hageman makes the leap of faith, and all of these atheists make the leap of faith that what Sam Harris produced was indicative of free will. That is a belief that he has.
SubhanAllah. I think it kind of stems into unfortunately, what happens in the science field is that philosophy becomes intertwined with science, so people can't distinguish the two, because the idea of seeing consciousness through physical means, that would mean, you'd have to be a physicalist. I know you've done more studying this.
Pure.
That means that, because there's the argument of, the soul and body, are they, is the soul in the body, in the mind or whatnot. So the fact that you're trying to do studies in order to somehow show that consciousness exists is under assumption that you're a physicalist in a philosophical sense. But you can probably expand more on this idea. I know kind of very basic fundamentals. If that's the case,
are you asking me?
Yeah. Sorry,
a little bit about pure materialism.
Pure materialism.
I think a lot of people don't realize what my philosophical position is. I actually subscribe to pragmatism. I'm a pragmatist by philosophical profession, I guess you could say. So I actually don't like these analytical arguments. I don't like a lot of these arguments in general. I find them to be, personally, to be a waste of time. I think there's an easier way to solve the issue. So, for example, why is there free will? For me, the answer is very simple. Because without the concept of free will, humanity as we know it ceases to function with any coherency. To suggest that we don't have any free will completely undermines all the values that we hold, and I think that's problematic. I think for humanity to be as it is today, to suggest that we are moral, that we are immoral, that we are this or that, we need to have free will. If we all say, well, we can't control ourselves, then really, what's the point of it all? Why are we even arguing? I don't see I don't see any reasoning. I see that as ludicrous. That's pointless to me. So for me as a pragmatist, I like to get to the heart of it and basically go, okay, why are you asking the question? What's the point of the question? what is the consequence of your question? And if the consequence is absurdity, and ultimately undermining, everything that we're actually arguing for, then I don't see any point in even believing or being skeptical of free will to begin with. Like, for me, Sam Harris is being ludicrous, because it's like he's saying, well, I believe you said he denies free will, or there's certain atheists as well who deny free will, and I'm like, okay, well, what's the consequence of that? That means that basically your entire project is forced, that you can't sit there and call yourself a free thinker. You can't call yourself really rational by any means, because you need to have some sort of choice in that respect. And if something is forcing you down that path, then who are you to talk down to me? It's not like I can choose to come to your side. It's not like you made the choice. And they make all these absurd arguments too with respect to religion. Like, well, you're only that religion because you were born into it. And it's like, well, how is that in any way, shape, or form undermine my religion when you believe that you were forced to become an atheist?
Wow.
You know what I'm saying? That makes no sense to me. Like, what's the point of your argument? So as a philosophical pragmatist, and by the way, our tradition, the Islamic tradition, exhibits pragmatist mentality, and from many scholars, by the way, Ibn Taymiyyah being one of them. And I don't mean to be anachronistic, but the term itself was just only recently coined, but the level of thinking, the type of thinking employed here was practiced long before that. So Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, used to practice a form of pragmatism in many of his arguments. So when it came to like ethics, for example, he would argue that the reason that we follow our fitra is because, that is the best way for humans to live. So that was actually a very pragmatic argument. He didn't try to argue on the basis of like sort of analytical truth, etc. He would basically see what is the consequence of not doing this. That was his primary means of argumentation. So likewise, I like to do that with atheists. I ask them, what's the point of your skepticism? Where does it lead us? And if it leads us down a bad path, a worse path, a path that is absurd, a path that is inconsistent, a path that is incoherent, why should I adopt that? Because that seems to me to be the opposite of truth.
SubhanAllah. Like, even, for example, I know those kind of old atheist philosophers like Nietzsche, even when they sort of went down the route of rejecting religion, they knew the consequences of that. So he would say, religion. Actually, sorry, that wasn't Nietzsche, but he was aware what the consequences were for going down an atheistic route, because there's no morality. So I guess the fitra does even kick in for those thinkers. Like, I guess the modern world will call fitra more instinct.
Intuition.
I don't know what those
is the appropriate term.
Intuition. Yeah. They know that there's consequences for it, but they know that religion holds that sort of morality in check, whereas for atheism, they go down these arguments. Like, you have Sam Harris now going down the deterministic route, which becomes dangerous. And I think actually I was listening to a bit of Safina Society podcast when I was coming here. They were talking about free will. He said that there was research done, and the idea that everything is determined will actually bring chaos, like you just mentioned, into the society. So giving an idea of free will, or a decision to have choice, will actually make a more fruitful society. And we know in the Islamic tradition it is intertwined. Like, that's the main thing about the Islamic sciences, where because we believe in Allah, we know the limitations and restrictions of our thinking, or what we can actually conceive as human beings. Whereas I guess what happens with atheists, thinkers, philosophers and whatnot, they are under the axiom that their brain and their rationality will sort of figure out everything around the world. But really that just causes more confusion. Like, they can do whatever they want, but I'm saying that they actually haven't pinpointed the basics of, for example, in Islamic Aqidah, we sort of go down the route of, you can't really perceive everything in the world from your mind, because that means that you have to be on God's level, Allah's level, in order to perceive everything. We know we can't. We only have, a pixel, and Allah has the whole picture, right? So we sort of define the limitations from the get-go, and everything we try to work, or we work in that paradigm. That doesn't mean that we say that, we have that kind of defeatist mentality when we engage with, I don't know, science, for example, like, oh, we can't figure out much about the world. We'll do as much as we can, but we know we have a certain limitation to do that, if that makes sense. And I feel that's where a lot of the crux of the issue is when it comes to having, you know, philosophers or atheist thinkers having this sort of discussion and dialogue about free will and predestination, for example. So
yeah, I mean, and when it comes to certainty too, you know, a lot of people don't realize is, and also truth is that what we're saying about truth and certainty is what we're saying is that our paradigm, the particular position that we hold, is the most coherent. We're not saying that we know everything. That's impossible. You know, but I think any rational person would say that, yeah, you know, what I believe is true because it is the most coherent worldview to hold. Not that I know 100% of everything. Unfortunately, a lot of atheists and you know they take this position where they need to have absolute certainty in the sense that they need to know 100% in order to adopt a position. And of course, that's also opposed to scientific methodology because science doesn't operate based on that.
SubhanAllah. Yeah, they're self-contradicting themselves, going down certain routes.
That's why I can't become an atheist, because they're so inconsistent with everything. It's like how can you live with all these inconsistencies?
SubhanAllah. I wanted to ask you. We're going down a nice conversation. I wanted to ask you specifically about nihilism and why if you can define it for the audience first, and then sort of talk about why, you know, for example, atheists go down that route, and why, and can we as Muslims sort of convey, because we obviously know through if you're a Muslim, for example, you know, nihilism doesn't make any sense, but even philosophically, are you able to prove the idea of nihilism being false, or just the whole idea of nihilism being, you know, rubbish, if that makes sense?
I don't like to say prove something is false in the sense. You can only prove things through logic and math. That said, you know, nihilism is problematic for a number of reasons. First off, it's the position that there is no objective meaning or transcendental meaning. There is only subjective meaning, you know, and it's considered to be a liberating philosophy in many respects, especially by existentialists, because for them it sort of it allows the human being to define themselves in many ways. That said, purpose itself, you know, there's no such thing as purpose per se. It's only purpose as you want it to be, as you think purpose is. So that's what really nihilism is in a nutshell. That said, the problem with that is that it undermines any objective analysis of any other person's purpose or meaning or moral conscience. So to say something is wrong, what you're really just saying is, I don't like it. And that's not really convincing to anyone with a rational mind, or considers themselves rational. It's appealing if you want to undermine, you know, objective morality, if you're simply seeking to undermine people's arguments. But as a position, as something to hold to in life, it really it doesn't help society function. It doesn't help the world function. It completely undermines values, societal values especially. You know, it doesn't provide a sufficient argument against tyranny and oppression, because, you know, a tyrant doesn't think he's a tyrant.
Yes.
So why should I care? You know, and that's the problem. It basically comes down to that the only reason that certain things are the way they are is because of power. Whoever is stronger, whoever is able to conquer the other person is in essence the one who is going to have their subjective understanding of things become the norm. And that's a scary world to live in.
Jumping back to the previous conversation you mentioned about free will, I was just thinking that entire time. How would you articulate the idea of free will and the relationship between free will and predestination to an atheist? I mean, there's a lot of confusion even amongst Muslims as to the nature of free will.
I find it hard to believe there's confusion. You know, I've thought about it. You know, I didn't require, you know, and I'm not trying to, you know, boast or anything. I just find it really simplistic, and I find it kind of weird how people are very confused about it, to be frank. Because to me, you know, the idea that God knows what's going to happen does not necessitate that people don't have choices. I mean, the very accusation that God knowing your choices means that you don't have a choice is self-refuting. Because in order for God to know you have a choice, and in order for God to know your choices in the future, you have to actually have choices to begin with, or the ability to choose, right? So it's like, for him to know that what you're going to choose, that already implies that you have the ability to choose, thereby not undermining the idea of free will.
So it's in very simple terms, the idea that just because God knew you were going to do it doesn't mean that he made you do it. I mean, you can do that experiment with little kids even. You can give them a choice, be like, here's a lolly, right? And here's a stick. And you know which one the kid's going to pick, right? This is a silly example.
I mean, you have a general understanding of what the
I
child
know
desires.
what's going to happen, right?
Generally speaking.
They're probably it's a dumb example, as I said, but it doesn't mean that I force the kid to pick which one, or for example, if you teach lessons and I think it's probably more easy to replicate in other more like scientific and psychological senses. Well, in the sense that
you also have to explain it from the sense that the reason that I know that is because I've seen you choose that without me forcing you in the past.
Yeah,
you see, so that the very example itself also showcases free will.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, it's nonsensical for me when I see people say, well, if God knows, therefore you don't choose. It's like, well, you don't have the choice. You're just forced. You're being forced. No, you're not being forced.
We did have Muslims like the Qadariya were the ones who denied Qadar. I think I get confused there. But I think it was was either the Jabariya?
Yeah, I think.
I think the Jabariya believed there was a sect in early Islam. There were a lot of sects in early Islam, but one particularly that would commit atrocities and say that they were predestined to commit those atrocities. So certainly
Mu'tazilites went to the other extreme, like complete free will, and then
even in my discussions with Shia Muslims today, I've actually had a long discussion with a Shia Muslim about the nature of free will, because they have adopted the Mu'tazila position on free will. So when we were talking particularly about Islamic history and events that took place within Islamic history, I think it's necessary, though, if you are like from that political persuasion, to have a Mu'tazili view, because it wouldn't make much sense if you had, the traditional mainstream Sunni view, like trying to justify the occurrences there and the philosophy there. So you kind of need that idea. But yeah, the idea in Mu'tazilism that the human being creates the action as well. Being very kind of important. I think that's the kind of distinction there.
I mean, but the qadr is always basically just that, your destination is already set in stone because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what you're going to do. The way in which the various sects, describe the details or discuss the details, varied. Mm-hmm. But in general, of course, there are people who also reject the qadr in general, but the majority, accept qadr and just say, Allah simply knows your choices. And the qadr can change on the basis of, if you make dua, your destination, your final outcome. So basically, for example, your qadr, like say, inshallah, all our qadr right now is Jannah, right? And, inshallah, right? So, but tomorrow, right now in this moment, yours and I, qadr is Jannah. But tomorrow, in that moment, if we sin or we reject our religion, then our qadr changes. You see, so the qadr is actually, it's within the moment also. The final qadr, Allah knows. But in every instance of our lives, our qadr can actually change.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that you were going to commit that action and change your qadr anyway, right?
Yeah.
I think there's like a hadith from memory. It was, quote me if I'm wrong, all the listeners, but the hadith was that I think if an angel comes down and tells you what your fate is, don't believe it, because you can actually change your fate, if that makes sense. So it ties in what you just said about, changing your qadr in regards to your free will. So they're sort of intertwined. But they are because it's dependent on your actions. Well,
so, like I said, your qadr today could be different tomorrow, and Allah can choose based on His free will, obviously, to take you at a certain time that your qadr is the way it's the way he wants it to be.
And he sort of intertwines with the idea of, we were speaking before, not ex-Muslims, non-Muslims, they talk about, why does hellfire exist? And it's to do with your will. Your will to disbelieve is, forever. And you use the example of, the baby and stuff. You can even say the same, that, for example, if you give, I don't know, if I'm a dad and I give my son, $10 and I want him to buy something for me, but he's being selfish and he just buys himself like candy for himself and he eats it. And you keep giving him the $10, but he keeps doing the same thing, and he's always going to do the same thing. He's not going to change. Like, at the end of the day, it's his free will. Even though I know what the situation, even though I've given him the $10 all the time, and I know what he's going to do, he's still making the choice. It's his intention. But I think the ex-Muslims try to divorce that whole idea, and they go down that deterministic route. Like you were on the you did the podcast with Video Vids, and I think his wife, I forgot her name, and she came on and she's like giving that example about, what about the nature? Like, because they go down the nature route, like, what if they give some random example? I think the example she gave is like some Hindu girl in the villages didn't know about Islam or this and that. Like, it comes down to the attention. Like, Allah judges in that situation, I assume, right? If she rejected the truth, then that's her will, right? If she didn't and she didn't experience Islam, but she believed in Allah, you know what I mean? Like, Allah decides. So it does come down to your will and your intention, right? So
and then also that particular incident, that episode also showcased her ignorance in terms of what Islam teaches about who actually gets punished in hell. As I mentioned earlier, it's not people who are ignorant; it's people who are arrogant and know the truth. So some random girl in a Hindu village who's never heard of Islam is not going to be punished for anything, because obviously she didn't have the opportunity to listen. How can she be arrogant about something she's ignored or not had any knowledge of, right? So
we were not punished until we sent a messenger to give warning.
Yeah.
In Surah
so that showcases right there, the general ignorance of these individuals who claim to say, "Oh, I studied so long, before I rejected." It's like, no, you didn't. You didn't do anything.
The point is that they know that they can get people emotionally, like non-Muslims who are sort of, a bit curious about Islam. When they hear these points, those ex-Muslims, like, Video Vids, when they bring up those points, they know they can scare people into thinking, oh, yeah, true. Why does or their definition of merciful, like, God has to be only merciful. Oh, why does a God have to, punish a Hindu girl like that? Like, they know they're latching onto straws, so they have to build that argument up.
I don't even think that they knowingly do. I think that that's enough for them. Like, sadly, and I think even worse is the fact that that's enough for them to disbelieve, right? Those very basic questions. It's not that they're trying to particularly manipulate the audience in their beliefs, but that they genuinely do disbelieve off those points, which I think to me is even worse.
No, I agree.
It's not even certainty.
I agree. I think that they're generally ignorant, and even their and I'm sorry I keep bringing them up. Even the Hassan Radwan, the father, he's generally very kind and respectful in his discussions. So, when I brought up the whole thing about hellfire not being for the ignorant, it's like he was completely taken aback. And this is a person who's apparently taught Quran. It's like, this is basic knowledge.
Yeah, to not
like,
know
how did you not know?
Classical position on that is like, it's one of the first things I learned about Islam was like, oh, okay, so there's kuffar, there's different, like, because in classical Islam there were different definitions of kuffar. There was like kuffar shar'i, and like the literal kafir, who was the kafir in society, and the kafir in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows on the day of judgment who will actually be considered a kafir and who will be considered amongst the righteous. Because the thing is that, and I always bring this point up to Muslims, who are the worst people? And they're I've blanked.
The Khawarij?
No.
That's true though.
No, the munafiqeen.
Yeah.
the munafiqs are the worst of creation. They occupy, I think, the worst part of the hellfire.
The hypocrites,
the hypocrites,
and they generally have the same mentality as the Khariji. They're basically they know that Allah exists, they know the truth, but they act in a certain way, and exactly. They behave. But
they're the worst, and they identify outwardly as Muslims, right? But in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're the worst. And you don't always know who they are in terms of that.
Yep.
The pious people, there are certain indications of that pious people may be aware of in a person's action, in a person's practice, that may indicate that they're in that kind of, that mentality and that state of being a munafiq or being a khawarij, from amongst the khawarij.
The munafiqeen do not know that
they're munafiqeen themselves. So you may identify outwardly as Muslim, but you're amongst the worst in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, like, even when I mention this to non-Muslims and atheists and skeptics, like, oh wow, I would never have thought that. It's like, it's one of the first things I learned about Islam. Yeah. And one of the first things that clicked in my mind. It's like, okay, what you identify yourself as outwardly is not necessarily the same as what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge you by.
Well, that's also just rational thinking in general. I mean, I always love it when I hear Islamophobes say, well, ISIS is Islamic because they call themselves Islamic. It's like, well, that makes no sense to me, because, North Korea calls themselves a democracy, but you don't, see anybody calling them a democracy.
It's like if I said Bismillah and ate a bacon sandwich, it doesn't mean that I've had a holy bacon sandwich.
It doesn't mean that bacon is halal now. Yeah.
Astaghfirullah, man.
Speaking on the Hellfire conversation, my knowledge of the seerah is kind of skipping my mind, but I remember there was, I think, a relative to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he disbelieved, but what happened is that on the day when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born, he was ecstatic and happy. So what's happened, I think he's in the Hellfire, but on the day that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born, I think it was Thursday, he won't actually cop the punishment of the Hellfire, just being happy that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born. So it actually shows Allah's mercy, even though the guy is, disbeliever. You know what I mean? Like, it's actually crazy how that kind of works. It kind of flies on the face of, there are numerous stories like this, and numerous ahadith where, where basically, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. No, it's adding on to what I'm saying, but yeah, go on, sorry.
I just want, there are many hadith where essentially, somebody has a mountain of sins, and, that one la ilaha illallah, that sincere la ilaha illallah saves them.
Yeah.
Because, the sincerity of their faith, despite their habitual sins, they really truly desired to repent and to be forgiven, and they're, brought into Jannah. You know what I mean? Like, there are several instances of this noted in the hadith that show Allah's mercy in this respect, and also prove what mercy really is. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to let you in even though you don't care what you did wrong.
So,
Like, that doesn't make any sense. That would make, if that was what our God really was about, that would make our God incompetent.
Yeah, exactly.
That means like Jannah has to be on earth.
Like, how can you believe in a God that would do that? Be like, yeah, you murdered thousands of people and you don't want to submit to me. Just go in. It's fine. You can join the party. It's like, no. Like, why? Like, he devalues the people who actually tried.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I learned very quickly as well, one of the things I realized is that God is apparently merciful. And this was when I was an atheist. I said no, because I heard ex-Muslims saying this, that the Muslim God isn't actually merciful. But then when I thought about it, this was before I actually took my shahada, I said, no, the Islamic God is merciful, because in the scripture, in the Quran and the Hadith, there's never mention of good people being put, or what even the Islamic definition of a good person, someone who is salih, being put in the hellfire. That never happened. But there were people who were from amongst, the wicked and the kind of the worst people in the society, who were allowed to enter Jannah by Allah's mercy, and people who disobeyed God for much of their life. So on that very simplistic level, you can see how apparently merciful the Islamic conception of God is. The fact that you may still gain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's favor through, even though you are a fasiq or disobedient. However, if you are upright and you do follow the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your intentions are good, you will never be demoted in the afterlife.
Yeah, like what I learned in my Aqidah class is that it's the fact that Allah rewards people who are doing good, Jannah, that makes him merciful, because he's not like, this is the Mu'tazila thinking. They thought that just by the fact Allah has to be bound by good, for example. But it's the fact that Allah set the rules in a way that he rewards people for doing good, that makes him merciful.
Even in fiqh, a mandub act, you're rewarded for doing, yet not punished for leaving. And a makruh act, you're not punished for doing, but you're rewarded for leaving. So you're actually rewarded for 4 out of the 5 categories and only punished for one, which is haram. So even if it's disliked, and I mean, I'm Maliki, so in fiqh, so
they're amazing stories.
There's a lot of things that are just considered disliked
in our tradition. There are stories where, like, for example, you obviously know the story of the woman who gave the cat or the dog water. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And there was also the case. I don't know if this story is actually authentic or not, but it's one that I've heard quite a bit, where the scholar who wrote just numerous works, claiming to be for the sake of Allah, he was brought before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah asked him, why should you go into Jannah? Do you believe it's because of your deeds? And he said, yes. And Allah said, no, none of your deeds will bring you into Jannah. You know what I mean? Like, he basically said, all of the works that you wrote for me are nothing, and they don't even go on your scale. And then the man was so depressed, and he basically said, then why would you let me in? And he said, for that one act, when you allowed the fly to land on your page as you were writing, and to drink the ink.
I've heard this story as well. Yeah. I think it was
it's amazing, it's like, because you granted mercy to that fly, I granted you mercy.
Even Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that it's not the deeds that get us into Jannah, it's because Allah's,
it's the mercy of Allah.
Yeah, mercy of Allah. And even Rasulullah sallam wouldn't be able to get into Jannah without Allah's mercy, subhanAllah.
I mean, I want to be clear here that the deeds are what help you get into Jannah.
Absolutely.
But if you think that your own actions are the ultimate, means of getting you in, and your arrogance takes over, then Allah can simply erase them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
the point of those stories.
It does then lead to the fact that your arrogance and your ego are probably two of the greatest barriers to your success.
That's the reason why people stay in hell.
Absolutely. And that's where the hellfire is purification for that specific thing. Like Allah, it's like hell isn't to just punish you per se, it's to purify you.
It's to humble you in a sense.
Yeah, like if you have that arrogance, the only way you'll be purified is through that hellfire doing its thing. That's what sort of people don't understand. Like just to take like a real life example, right? We know, the deen, for the most part, because me and Raf like 21, 22, we have people in our age that are struggling with the deen, and it's hard, living in the secular liberal society. You're bombarded with all these ideologies and, fitna and desires and whatnot, partying, drinking, zina. But I'd respect someone that actually, not obviously doing the act, but at least what I'd hone in on is their connection with Allah. Like, for example, if someone is going to party it up and stuff, still at least pray your 5 prayers, because that sincerity and humbleness, being close to Allah, will inshallah overweigh that desires that you have to party it up later on, you know what I mean? So the whole idea, like, someone could be in a club and partying it up, but if they have that slither of guilt being there, knowing it's wrong, that's why, like, if they continue those actions, they might be in hell, because of their sins, but it's because of their connection to Allah that eventually, inshallah, they'll be in Jannah anyway. Comparing it with someone who is actually going out there and, actively disobeying and actively denying God outright, that's why the punishment are there for the people who cover the truth, like the kuffar. So
and that's why some people are punished for eternity, because they cannot relieve themselves of their own arrogance. They believe that they are entitled to be given mercy or to be given Jannah simply by virtue of being there, and they refuse to submit and to claim that they're wrong. And a lot of people don't seem to realize that. And I've even seen ex-Muslims, after they hear these things, and atheists, they say, well, how is it possible after being punished for so long that these people would still, not submit? And I said, you don't know what an arrogant person is.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't understand arrogance.
SubhanAllah. Like, imagine, like, I know sometimes real life examples aren't the best and don't convey the whole message, but I like kind of taking something, in perspective on what we experience day to day. And for example, your mother, who's, that's why Allah punishes people who are disobedient to their parents. Like, imagine this, like, your mother who cared for you, this and that, brought you up, struggled for you, paid for, fed you, all that sort of stuff up to, you're 15 or 18. And the guy is disobedient. Like, why? Like, you gain so much from your parents. Why would you be disobedient? But it's just, if you take that example across, if you're denying Allah, it's like denying my mother. I don't know. Like someone that's been there, you know.
I thought you were going to go into the example of how, and it was a good example as well. But the one you gave was very, very good point. But I thought you were going to mention the fact that even though my mother had such a strong connection, love, and bond with me, and obviously I was her only child, and that connection is something that is metaphysical between a mother and her child. Yeah. But even then, she still punished me when I was a kid.
Oh yeah,
yeah, exactly.
She still disciplined me, and even though that wouldn't have been easy for her, I still copped quite a bit, but that was for the better. And the idea, I don't understand why Westerners throw the idea out the window. Not Westerners, I'm a Westerner. Why atheists throw the idea of punishment out the window when it comes to metaphysical realities and the ideas of the afterlife. However, they can accept the fact that their mother could punish them for their own good. That's just another sort of illogical.
But wallahi, you cannot imagine how many atheists that I've confronted who will legitimately tell me, I mean, just like they literally will tell me that, like, I'll bring up the example, what if your son is a serial killer? Would you turn them in? And they say no.
Oh, wow.
Because they love their kids so much. And it's like, I don't know how you can call that love. That sounds insane to me. Like, if my son, no matter how much I love them, if they were going around murdering people for the good, for the betterment, for the just the principle of it, right? To truly show what ethics is, you know, I would punish my son because that would be the right thing to do. I would not expect anything less from even my son himself. If I want my son to be a good person, I would expect him to do the same to me. So why are you sitting here saying, yeah, you know, I would protect my family no matter what, even if they were like mass murdering psychopaths? Like, what is wrong with you?
SubhanAllah. I wanted to quickly ask you, we talked a lot about punishment, hellfire and stuff, but just wanted to ask you a quick question about, this is another contention that atheists seem to bring up, is the idea of, you know, when they talk about God, that it's like, oh yeah, you know, religious people believe in God. It's the same as me believing, you know, a pink giraffe is flying around on Mars. You know, it's such a idiotic kind of comparison, but you have to, as we talked about earlier, you know, people like Imam Ghazali and stuff, they have to still address these points. You know what I mean? You can't give any weight to it, by just leaving it alone. So how would you kind of tackle that contention?
Well, there's a major error there in the sense that, first off, it's a category error. That would be the major fallacy that we would cite there. And what I mean by that is that these examples, like flying giraffes, invisible giraffes, or whatever, in fact, these analogies are fallacious because they're actually composites of physical reality. Whereas the concept of God is outside of physical reality. We don't consider God to have any sort of physical attributes. So, for example, when you say, oh, it's the same as believing in fairies. Well, no, it isn't, because in fact, I would need empirical evidence to verify the existence of fairies, because when you describe a fairy to me, you're describing a little person with wings, right? It's just a little person with wings. It's a composite. Same thing with a pink giraffe. You're just putting pink and a giraffe together, flying around. You know, that's something that I should be able to verify with my senses. But the concept of God cannot, we don't describe God in that way. He has nothing to do with the physical world. So that's one big issue there. And the second assumption would be that you can empirically verify God. Like I said, God is outside of empirical reality. And I would even question, why is that even necessary to verify most things empirically? Like I said, the majority of things that most atheists believe in, most people in general believe in, don't require empirical reality. In fact, an empirical verification. In fact, 90% of the things that most human beings believe in has no empirical validity.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, morality. Everything that makes you a human being has no empirical validity. We don't require that in order to function in the world. The political theories you hold to, the economic theories you hold to, the moral theories you hold to, the concept of human rights, concept of love, freedom, loyalty, trust, etc. All of these things that we constantly live by and consider to be realities don't have any scientific or empirical basis whatsoever. And yet the world works.
Subhanallah. I think, would you say that this is an offshoot of the fitra? Because underlying, they have a sort of instinct or to believe something, and they go by that, and that's why they don't require, empirical scientific means. But however, the funny thing is that they go to those lens to disprove religion, specifically to say you need empirical, scientific reasonings and stuff like that. But what's your take on that idea?
Well, they're just inconsistent.
Subhanallah.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Maybe I didn't get the question. So what I was saying is that, because you just mentioned that you don't, 90% of the things is not, you don't come to those conclusions through empirical, scientific means, right?
Uh-huh.
So what I'm saying is that from Islamic point of view, would that be an offshoot of using the fitra?
Fitra, yeah. I mean, it's intuitive. I mean, most things that we as human beings understand about reality is basically intuitive. The details are filled in as we go along. I mean, generally, like I said, people walk outside, they don't think they're living in a matrix for a reason. There are certain assumptions that the mind has to adopt in order for the human body and the human existence itself to function in the world. Morality, that there are transcendent values that we can all appeal to. These are very natural things that humans hold to. These are natural inclinations that we have, and that's how we function in the world. I mean, for example, I'm sorry I bring up human rights a lot here, but I have to, because I think that's the most prominent belief system today, especially within the West, is that in order for human rights to work, in order for human rights to be taken seriously, you can't have a bunch of people going around going, well, it's just a human construct that we all just happen to choose because we just feel like it. That has no legal weight. That has no moral weight. You can't tell people that they're wrong, that they're violating human rights if you go and if you make that argument. That makes no sense. Nobody cares if you made that argument.
Exactly.
In fact, you have to say that people actually have rights. In order to say people actually have to have rights and have to have that conviction, you have to believe that there's some transcendent value to human beings. Right. So that's the thing that's as a pragmatist, that's why I don't take these arguments seriously, because it's like, you don't act that way.
Yeah.
If you really believe what you said, that there's no real objective values, then you wouldn't believe in human rights. That makes no sense.
And I wanted to segue into, because we talked a lot about metaphysical stuff and hellfire and stuff. You also did a paper on, from memory, it's called The Rise and Decline of Scientific Productivity, and
that was my first paper.
Mashallah. And it's because obviously it's dealing with the Muslim world. So I wanted to ask you specifically, you obviously would have come to your own, you would have made some findings and came to your own conclusions. I guess the idea of the whole paper was to discover what actually caused the rise and fall of science, because we live in that scientific age, so we want to find out the answers to these. But first question would be, why what was the reason for science rising in the Muslim world, especially in the Islamic Golden Age?
Just before you answer that question, there were two sort of points that I remember hearing from. One was Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he basically said that the reason for the decline of the Islamic Golden Age...
You say Imam Ghazali?
Yeah, he literally said Imam Ghazali was the reason.
Yeah.
No, but basically he put it down to the fact that Mu'tazila theology went into decline, and thus...
nonsense.
Sorry.
Go on.
This is really funny, because there's this series, I forgot something project on YouTube, I forgot the name, but some guy, he does videos of history, science within history, and then he went into depth about Muslim history. This guy was I can tell he's a Mu'tazila sympathizer. So he started saying that it's so weird, it started making me realize how things like educational resources can kind of corrupt your mind to think in a certain way. You can take in what he said in what he detailed in history, which is fine, but he started sprinkling in these ideas of the Mu'tazilites.
I genuinely didn't like Al-Ghazali when I was an atheist.
Yeah,
I genuinely didn't like him.
Because they have the monopoly of portraying what really happened in history. They'll show it in videos and stuff. Unfortunately, Muslims don't do it as enough as, I guess the rest of the world do when they utilize YouTube and stuff. So within them doing and dictating the series of events, they actually sprinkle their ideas, like their own ideologies and philosophies. And he said the same thing. He started quoting at the end of the video, like, when science declines, the civilization declines or something like that. Like, I guess there's an element of truth to it, but he's trying to portray that because of Mutazilism. I don't know how you say it. But anyways, because of the decline of that's why the Muslim world went into disarray.
And then the other one I heard was that there was no Muslim golden age at all, and that it's all a great myth.
That's not
from Islamophobes. Yeah, that's a funny one actually.
That is so absurd that no academic, no one takes that seriously.
Subhanallah.
When the majority, when the consensus, the ijma in even secular academia is to reject that thesis, there's some nonsense there. That's number one. And maybe we can address that later point, but I want to really go after kind of the whole attack on Al-Ghazali and maybe discuss in detail like what the rise and decline, what the real factors were behind those things. So first off, the idea that Al-Ghazali was the reason behind decline is absurd for a number of reasons. Number one, the idea that one person would be responsible for the entirety of the scientific tradition, Islam, to be, put to a halt is utterly absurd. And there's no evidence to support that because there's no evidence to support that Al-Ghazali was taken as the primary authority in the Islamic tradition, after his death. That's number one. Number two, this was really proposed by Orientalists who were trying to explain the decline of scientific productivity through a Christian lens, because for them, which is also very mythological in many ways too, for them, Christianity was the primary reason behind scientific decline in Christian civilization. Like I said, this has now been proven to be a myth as well. So they wanted to apply this to the Islamic tradition. So they found somebody they felt was, quote unquote, anti-rational or anti-science. And then they found another group that they felt were, quote unquote, scientific and rational, and then pitted them against each other and had this very convenient narrative that, this one guy defeated all of these people and now, the destruction of Islamic civilization as we know it. And that was basically it for a long time. That said, a number of scholars over the years, past decade or so, have found this to be completely absurd position to hold. It is no longer taken seriously by the majority of academics, especially by the likes of George Saliba and others who have examined this narrative in detail and found there to be a number of anomalies that just make no sense, that make it completely and utterly incoherent. So, for example, if I may, just let me find some details here. I'm just opening my paper here. I just want to show some things. Okay. So the Mu'tazila, for one, they weren't that popular in Islamic civilization. In fact, they died out quite early. They only were in power, in fact, political power, for 34 years. And the Islamic Golden Age lasted well beyond that and well before that. What we find instead is not that because the Mu'tazila were defeated, quote unquote, that suddenly science declined. Because, why would, after their quote unquote defeat in the political sphere and by the majority of traditional theologians, why would the Islamic Golden Age last until the 17th century? That makes no sense.
Just holding that point, can you just define for people, listeners who don't know about Mu'tazilites, if you can just define that and then go on with the point, because some people might be a bit confused.
But essentially,
just a very rough idea.
Essentially, they weren't rationalists per se. They held some orthodox positions in many respects. So they were a group of theologians who dominated the theological scene in Iraq for more than a century. They had a rationalist approach, quote unquote, towards basic doctrines of faith that led them to have certain heretical viewpoints, such as the fact that Allah is a mere abstract concept that's completely incomprehensible to the human intellect. They were also opposed to the orthodox view that his divine essence cannot be comprehended in toto, and his attributes had a reality that was relative or relatively comprehensible to the lay Muslims, like in a sense that his attributes cannot be taken as they are, that they were metaphorical in many ways. So this was a big problem for most theologians who wanted to take the apparent meaning of the text, and they were generally considered heretics throughout Islamic history. That said, they did have a small following for land. They did have political power, in fact, for about 34 years in Islamic history, and only 34 years in Islamic history. It's when you examine it from that point of view, it's kind of ridiculous to assume that they had so much influence that they would have started the Golden Age or kept it going for several centuries afterwards. That the Golden Age, was suddenly was like automatic. It didn't have anybody else influencing it. So that's kind of nonsense. Also, the fact that we found that the Golden Age started way before the Mu'tazila, and in fact, from the very beginning of the Umayyad dynasty, when the Muslims were conquering neighboring lands, they were translating texts immediately, and they were doing so for a specific reason. And what a lot of these Orientalists don't really explain is the reason behind the translation movement. So for those who don't know, the Muslims initially were translating a lot of Greek text so that they could understand the sciences of the Greeks. And the reason they had this interest was very specific, because they wanted to use those texts for practical value. For their practical value. What I mean by that is the main reason that the texts were first translated was because Muslims needed to learn alchemy. And why did they need to learn alchemy? Do you know the answer to this?
Why they need, for I guess medical purposes?
Why did they need to learn how to melt metals?
To make stuff, I guess.
Make what specifically, though? You don't know?
No.
So when the Islamic polity started, when it came into power, and it was competing with neighboring empires, it needed its own currency because it was currently borrowing from the Byzantines. So their first thing was like, well, we need money. We need to be able to mint our own gold so that we can distinguish ourselves and our currency from neighboring nations. Because if we keep borrowing our currency from the people we're fighting, that's not a good thing, right? That would be nonsense. It's like if you're at war with China and you're using their currency, that would be atrocious. That would backfire on you quite quickly, because they can control the value of their own currency and basically bankrupt you. So that was their first intention. Then, of course, they needed to make weapons. They needed to make all sorts of things. And as they started translating these texts, they started realizing they needed to be able to run the government. They needed to be able to collect taxes. So what do they need to learn after that? How do you make, excuse me?
Algebra and stuff? Like mathematics?
Basic arithmetic.
Yeah.
Mathematics. So they needed mathematics to, make records, especially for taxes, right? Then they needed to determine inheritance laws. They needed to determine the motion of the stars and the timing of, of when certain constellations were there. And what did they need to learn for that? Astronomy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it just went as a domino effect, basically. So essentially, the rise of science and Islamic civilization was based on purely pragmatic means. They needed these sciences, and they needed to modify these sciences for the betterment of their own civilization.
Yeah, like the translation movement, I looked into it, is like massive. I think, sorry to quickly cut you off, I'll just quickly add, because I mentioned this in a previous podcast, how even the idea of hieroglyphics, so in the past, how we're taught in Western sort of culture and schooling systems, like what I learned in high school is that Jean-Paul Champollion, I think that's his name, the French guy who found the Rosetta Stone, and he kind of deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics. But what I actually came to know when I was doing my research a bit on the translation movement is that it actually ended up being a Muslim person, I think it was a scholar, who had, during the translation movement, trying to gather as much, documents and stuff, he actually deciphered 70% of the Egyptian hieroglyphics already, and this was like ages ago, because the whole Rosetta Stone situation only happened like 100 years ago, I think. So that's actually like the extent of the translation movement. Like it has ripple effects into the contemporary times as well. So yeah,
I mean, and these are things is that when you translate text, you also, there's something else that a lot of the Orientalists didn't realize, is that the Muslims understood the value of these books before they translated them. because they needed to in order to translate them, right? So they knew that there was something in those books that they needed. So they already had a value for science prior to reading these texts. That's something that's not really spoken about. So what occurred eventually is that with all of these things is that the Muslims had to modify these texts or modify a lot of these theories, etc., to help benefit them further. And this is really how the golden age kind of occurred, and this is how Muslims became more advanced. And it was purely for pragmatic reasons. There wasn't anything, and something else that's interesting about this is that it showcases that our religion is not opposed to science, because obviously the Quran and everything else didn't get in the way of these advances. So, and then maybe that's something else we can discuss at a later point, especially with the whole idea about scientific miracles in the Quran. But anyways, another way that Muslims practiced a very pragmatic understanding of things is through writing. The early Muslims were all Arabs for the most part. They were primarily an oral culture, meaning that they memorized things, without having to read them, and they primarily passed down knowledge through speech. And what you find later on is that a lot of people ask, well, why were the hadith written later? Well, you need to understand something. Who were the primary collectors of written hadith? Were they Arabs or Persians?
Persians.
Yeah.
Bukhari was a Persian.
Why? Okay, so Persians, were they an oral culture or a written culture?
Written, definitely.
Written culture. That's why they had to write it down, because they can't memorize the same way as the Arabs could. So it wasn't. So people make this accusation that the hadith had to be written down later because they were being made up and things like this, and that it shows that that these were all fabricated, or that these ridiculous accusations. And that's not the case. The reason is because the Persians are not an oral culture. Is because they had to write them down in order to memorize them. So that's the real reason. It's a simpler explanation. It's a more coherent explanation.
I heard the argument of the other argument was that people wanted to learn the practices of Islam, and that they prioritized that as well, like the fiqh as well. They prioritize a lot of things, but you have to understand that the medium of learning was primarily written for Persians. Yep.
So now that we have that, because the Persians required writing in order to understand the faith.
According to most narrations, even Abu Hanifa was Persian, and he was the great founder of written fiqh. Before that, fiqh was just transmitted from the Sahaba to the Tabi'een, and
because the Maliki were primarily oral.
Yeah, and I think it was Al-Muwatta came quite a few years after.
That was the exception to the rule.
Yeah, that was definitely one. But that came quite a few years after Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa is generally seen as the founder of fiqh as a discipline. And
I agree.
He was a Persian man who was in Kufa in Iraq, and he had the role of trying to convey, because there were a lot of new converts to Islam towards the end of the Umayyad era, and he really had to codify fiqh for the.
The Shafi'i really codified it, but Imam Abu Hanifa really started the movement. And another evidence that we have of the difference between the Arabs and the Persians is through the Maliki madhab, because if you notice the Maliki madhab, even in contemporary times, they take the Amal of Medina over hadith.
Yeah,
and the Amal of Medina was a oral tradition.
Yeah, it's considered a mutawatir hadith if the Tabi'een of Medina agreed upon something. Because if the Tabi'een of Medina, the scholars amongst them anyway, agreed upon something, they would never, the understanding was that they could never agree upon something erroneous.
Yeah.
So why would all of the knowledgeable men, 2 generations and women as well, after 2 generations after the Prophet ﷺ, all be in a consensus over something that wasn't what the Prophet ﷺ taught? And the fact that that must be stronger than a piece of paper that you find.
Yep.
And so
which showcases it's the evidence of the difference in their culture and the difference in
and they were almost entirely Arab for a very long time, the Malikiya.
Yep. So that's just another piece there. So these are things that are, if you research, and if you actually research history and research the Islamic tradition, these questions, these doubts that a lot of people have, especially about hadith and especially our traditions, etc., become, evaporate instantly. It just requires a bit of time and nuance. That said, going back to the subject matter, our decline cannot be influenced by Al-Ghazali by any means, because the thing that Al-Ghazali did maybe people didn't realize with his tahafut was that he was refuting the Aristotelian philosophers during his time period. And he was refuting something very specific. Even in the introduction to his tahafut, he makes it very clear that he's trying to refute the metaphysical assumptions of the Aristotelian philosophers, who actually believed that the other sciences, like the physical sciences and mathematics, were the same as their metaphysical beliefs. So the objective of his text was not only to refute them on their erroneous opinions regarding religion and God, but was also to refute them on the notion that the sciences, as we know them today, equate to metaphysics. And that was something that is essential for modern science to even exist.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a very modern.
Yeah, it's a modern view,
well, isn't it?
And in
probably
fact,
the predominant one.
Many of the great Muslim scientists borrowed extensively from Ghazali's viewpoints, or in the very least, continued his thinking, and that is how they were able to go against a lot of the assumptions from Greek philosophers and Greek scientists of the past. That's how they were able to modify Greek theories, because they stepped away from the idea that their scientific understanding was equivalent to their metaphysics. So essentially, Orthodox Islam, Orthodox Aqidah, is what, refuting a lot of the Aristotelian assumptions, is what freed science from the Greeks and allowed the Muslims to progress. Now, with that understanding in mind, and that is something that has been well established, I think, at this point in contemporary academia, how do we know the decline? What happened during the decline? Now, that is still being figured out. I've come up with my own theory that I can express here for you guys if you want.
Please do. Yeah.
My theory is that essentially that after the 16th century, you start to see a decline or a stagnation in Islamic or Muslim ingenuity. And the reason for that is because the Ottoman Empire was actually starting to look towards the West they were competing with the West, but they were looking towards the West as well in terms of reforming themselves, because they started losing battles. There was a lot of instability in the empire, and they started to realize that they didn't have, how should I put it? The Western mind's freedom from religious orthodoxy is what was leading them to advance. So from the Ottoman perspective, by sort of compartmentalizing religion to one side and bringing in philosophy, for example, they felt that they could also advance. So what they did was something very interesting and also very destructive to the Islamic tradition and the Islamic scientific tradition. They started to readopt Aristotle. And what you find in the Ottoman madrasa system is that they started to adopt texts from the 11th to 12th and 13th centuries that were very much what we considered Aristotelian natural philosophy. And they started to adopt astrology again. They started to adopt things that were completely antithetical to our Aqidah. And as a result of that, they started to overturn the practical methodology of previous Muslim scientists by basically thinking that Aristotelian natural philosophy was immune from criticism.
I have sort of 2 points to just, sorry to butt in, but I have a couple of points that...
I have some further evidence for that.
Yeah, sorry,
so, for example, if I may, so in the 1690s, Europe went through a major transition in its educational curriculum. So it started to reject Aristotelian traditionalism or Aristotelian naturalism, and it started to adopt Cartesianism. And that has its own flaws, but the basic theme here was that they were rejecting Aristotle, and that's how the Renaissance and the Enlightenment occurred. Anyway, so however, during the same period, the Ottoman Empire was making textbooks out of like 13th century manuals, such as the Hidayat al-Hikmah by Al-Abhari, who basically promoted Aristotelian logic, metaphysics, and natural philosophy in his text. And it was one of the most famous textbooks circulated in the madrasa system between the 17th and 18th centuries. So while the Aristotelians were rejecting Aristotle and advancing through the Enlightenment, Muslims in general in the madrasa system were still adopting Aristotelian textbooks for their scientific learning.
Well, to bounce off what you said, I think even during the Ottoman times, they would look to, not just from, because you're looking from more academic perspective, like what they're adopting in the madrasa systems. I think even the fact that, banking systems, insurance and all that, I think they started adopting that from the West. I might be wrong though, but there was that.
The banking, not so much. I mean, the early form of a bank without riba was adopted by Muslims. I mean, we had sort of like, places you could put your gold and your assets and pay a fee. That was fine. But aspects of riba were essential to the banking system within Christian and Jewish nations before that, actually. So, I mean, if you want to say contemporary banking, during that period of time, yeah, sure. I mean, they started adopting those systems, and I agree with you in that sense that, I mean, the Tanzimat reforms were one indication of political reform.
That was much later
the West.
than the time period that you were mentioning.
They were adopting the French system, so this was a consistent theme from the 17th century onwards, that the Ottomans were consistently looking to the West for all sorts of reforms.
I think one sort of point I wanted to ask you about, though, was the idea that I think one of the discussions I was having with my father and through my own kind of cursory glance at the history of Islamic thought, how the more rationalist inclined traditions, if you can call them rationalists, which is something you can question, about the Mu'tazila and thinkers such as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, were really adopted with gusto in the Latin tradition, and then that sort of formed the bedrock for Renaissance and Reformation, and that kind of traditional narrative that the Muslim world took the kind of mystical route, spearheaded by thinkers like Al-Ghazali, whereas the West took the more Mu'tazila inclined route, spearheaded by from the influence of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. How accurate is that depiction?
The thing is, what occurred essentially was that the West took the same pathway as the Muslims did initially. So what the Muslims did is they initially adopted the Aristotelian tradition and then modified it. They saw the errors in its ways, and they saw how it didn't conform with their values, and then they started to modify it and built upon those modifications in accordance with their values. However, they declined as a result of readopting the very thing that they rejected. Whereas with the Europeans, what they did is essentially that they adopted Aristotle, then they also rejected Aristotle, but they kept rejecting Aristotle. They didn't go back to Aristotle. So the decline really occurred for us. The difference was that we went back to that. So basically, the Ottomans, primarily the Ottomans, unfortunately believed that their problems were a result of having rejected Aristotle also. they ironically they adopted Aristotle again, which is actually which further led to the stagnation and decline.
Do you mind just quickly mentioning Aristotle himself, who he was, and his influence on the Islamic tradition in terms of thought?
He's a Greek philosopher. He's still very influential to this day in many respects. I mean, logic is the whole structure of logic is still adopted, which is fine. Al-Ghazali adopted Aristotelian logic. He's a Greek philosopher. He was a student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates, and he corrected a lot of Plato's understanding of things. So, for example, Plato was an idealist. He believed that the forms of things, the actual essence of things, existed outside of those things, meaning that there was some realm of ideals, like real triangles existed in math, existed outside in some just this realm outside of perceived existence. And so, even animals, like the shape of a horse, the form of a horse existed outside of the horse, somewhere else, like the ideal horse. And then Aristotle thought that was nonsense. And he was like, no, the ideal forms exist within the things themselves. And they're particulars, So that was his main idea, the main thrust of his position opposed to his teacher. And he was very much an empiricist in many ways. He was also a rationalist. He tried to be a lot of things at once. And he was very influential upon everyone from his point on. But, when modern philosophy came into the picture, when Descartes came into the picture, let me talk from the Islamic position. When Muslims came into the picture, Aristotle was overturned. And that's why we had the Golden Age. And for the Christian tradition, it had to be Descartes.
Much later.
Yeah, our Descartes was Al-Ghazali. So we actually advanced prior to the Western world. It's just that we lost our way because we refused to continue that advance, and we readopted the very thing that we rejected.
So some 600 years before Descartes as well. That's incredible.
Exactly. And some people even say Descartes borrowed extensively from Al-Ghazali.
Yeah, I've read into that.
So the fact that the Ottomans didn't learn from their own history, and they were so obsessed with competing with the West, they were so narrow-minded in their approach, that's what led to the intellectual downfall of the Ummah. In reality, was the attempt of the Ottoman Empire to modernize itself by adopting old modes of thinking that the Westerners themselves were rejecting at the very same time.
I have a friend of mine who has a very, the meme nowadays, unpopular opinion, but so ... One of my friends has a version of that meme, unpopular opinion, but the Ottomans didn't really contribute much to the Ummah besides a strong military. What would you say to that?
They didn't. I know that, and now it's going to make a lot of Turkish people mad.
I know. I think when he said that to me, I was like, you can't say that. And then I sat down for a while and I sort of stared into a pond, and then I realized, wait a minute.
Where did the pond come from?
I was just sitting in a park, and I stared into a pond. The metaphorical pond of reflection. And I looked, and I realized that maybe they didn't.
Well,
just maybe.
Fair though. Let's be fair, they did contribute some things. I mean, there were a number of things they did contribute. There were a number of inventions and even logic. Because they were so obsessed with the readopting Aristotle, they actually advanced logic in many ways. But of course, because they were so busy with the abstract, that they fell behind in terms of the practical benefits of things. And that's why the Western militaries, et cetera, were eventually able to overcome them, because they were more concerned with empirical verification and things that the Muslims had adopted prior. To a great extent. So the Ottomans also, and maybe this is going to make a lot of Turkish people angry as well, but the Ottoman Empire also contributed to the downfall of the Ummah in terms of political, because they're the ones the Ottoman Empire is the one who adopted all those reforms to begin with. I mean, the fall of the caliphate was not necessarily from outside forces. It was because Ottoman politicians, dismantled it piece by piece from the inside.
Yeah. They put it on themselves.
I mean, the Tanzimat reforms were the initial, end of the caliphate. It wasn't because the Europeans came in and did much. I mean, they influenced, but it was because the Ottomans themselves led to their own destruction.
So I wanted to because we might have to wrap up in like 5-10 minutes, but I want to ask you two quick questions. But I think we had like good. Alhamdulillah, I think a lot of people benefit from this because we talked about, it's more geared towards, atheism, science, and, hellfire, and a lot of metaphysical concepts.
Sorry if I'm sounding a little incoherent now, it's just that it's late and I'm having a hard time talking.
Yeah, you've not been incoherent at all. I think it's just the nature of our discussions typically is that we move around a fair bit, and it's kind of a very free-flowing, loose, not very rigid structure of a discussion, but some people enjoy that, and in the end we still cover everything, inshallah.
Before this episode, you mentioned about, because I know you did, I think it was your thesis on ISIS. We didn't obviously cover ISIS, but I want to touch on it now. But you mentioned the idea of your experiences as a civilian contractor fighting ISIS in Malaysia, so that's actually pretty interesting to have in your bio or in your resume. So I want to touch on that as well, and some listeners can hear in what your experiences have been.
Okay. I didn't know if that was coming into the discussion, but, I don't like to mention it that much. I only mention it when it's relevant, because it's something that I've noticed only lately that it's helpful to have on my side when I'm discussing these issues, because, these days people like anecdote more than anything and personal experience. So, and maybe this is something that I should make more public more often. But yes, while I was in Malaysia for the last few years that I was there, I was working on my PhD at University of Malaya, and I minored in counterterrorism. And during this period, ISIS started coming around, and they weren't really affecting Malaysia at the time, but eventually they did enter Malaysia. They gained some recruits in Malaysia, especially from Thailand. And for those who don't know, Thailand there's a separatist movement of Patanis who were actually Thai Malay people who have been generally oppressed by the Thai government, and want to have an independent state, and they tend to act out in militant ways. So ISIS reached out to them and supplied them with weapons, and they affiliated themselves with ISIS as a result of that. So they were basically a splinter group. Anyway, so because the Malaysian government was working alongside Thailand in many ways, they decided that they were going to conduct operations within Malaysia. And in 2016, the Movida Bar attack happened, where a group of young Malays, drove on a motorcycle and threw a grenade inside a bar and injured and killed a lot of people. So during that period of time, Malaysia wanted to do a crackdown. So they sent the military and the police out and basically tried to arrest a bunch of people and tried to shut down these cells. And they hired a number of foreigners, such as myself, who were studying counterterrorism, to assist the military and police force. So I was one of those individuals. I was recruited as a civilian contractor to assist the Malaysian police force and the Malaysian military in operations against ISIS affiliates and members in the country. So first I was hired on to basically just give lectures to the youth at universities about the fallacies of ISIS reasoning and how they're not authentically Islamic. And then eventually I was asked to aid in a field operation where I was accompanied by 8 soldiers and 2 other contractors, and we trekked basically 20 kilometers to the north of the Malaysian border into Patani territory, where we were informed to act like UN observers, and then we conducted field research there, and we basically did some spying. And we found weapons caches there, and as a result of our research, we found basically an encampment, and we had several hundred members arrested, and successfully ended the crackdown at that point. So alhamdulillah, after that, Malaysia no longer had an issue. I mean, obviously there's some supporters there here and there, but generally the flow of weapons has ceased. And
well, ISIS is kind of a spent force now politically.
Yeah, they're spent force, but this happened prior. So Malaysia was one of the first Muslim countries to really solve the issue very quickly. I mean, it only took a few months. So the operation lasted 6 months, the crackdown. And the operation that the specific operation that I conducted alongside other members was within the last 2 months. And it took about 3 days. So that was successful. And I will say that it was risky. Obviously, my life was on the line.
Like, were there times when you were
terrified? Trekking through the jungle in the middle of the night is not fun, especially when you're not the one with night vision. Oh, wow. And so I was armed. I was trained for a combat role. That said, alhamdulillah, we never got into a firefight. There were close calls at times, but we were successful in avoiding any bloodshed. So I cannot say the same for some of my compatriots. Unfortunately, some of the members that I conducted these operations with eventually were shipped out to Iraq and Syria to assist the coalition forces there, and they did not come back. So may Allah grant them, Jannah for their sacrifice. So, this is something that I've had personal experience with. I have met many terrorist supporters, many terrorists themselves. I have conducted research. I have conducted interviews. Not all of them are foaming at the mouth psychopaths. Some of them are just confused youth who feel like they don't have any other solutions. Most of them don't know their religion very well. Some of them can't even recite Surah Fatiha. And, they're generally very ignorant. And, I felt bad that I had to arrest even some of them because I felt like they honestly didn't know what they were doing.
And we have the case now with returned fighters and wives as well. These young girls who were manipulated into going over there. I'm sure you're aware of the case of Shamima Begum in the United Kingdom.
And some of them, I'm going to be frank with you, some of them I believe do not deserve sympathy. I think some of them were not ignorant.
Yeah, perhaps.
and I can say that with a great deal of confidence. And the reason why is because, I mean, what I mean to say is ignorant of Islam, sure, but ignorant of their actions.
They should have known better. Yeah.
You know, if
They
you're
had the
going to go over
faculties.
there and you're cutting people's heads off and you're okay with it, then there's a problem. You know, it doesn't matter.
You're probably not going to be a great participant if released back into civil society if you've had experience in beheading
but
people.
there should be some punishment.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's the thing is that, you know, and you know, I'm also very upset about that. How, on the one hand, we want to deny people coming back to be punished appropriately, but at the same time, we're okay with bringing people back, such as Tanya Joya. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
No,
but she was formerly an ISIS bride who became an ex-Muslim, and all of a sudden, you know, it's okay.
Yeah.
I've heard about that story. That's actually
so that makes me really upset. So, I mean, my personal experience, I think it helps me a lot to understand the situation, but it also helps me to. A lot of ex-Muslims and a lot of Islamophobes hate me for this. Because I've actually done something, or I've tried to. I mean, I'm not saying that I've done more than anybody else. I mean, I know a lot of Muslims who died fighting these people, as I mentioned earlier, you know, so they deserve more credit than anyone else. That said, a lot of people hate me. A lot of people who attack Islam hate me because I'm something that they can't handle. They can't explain. And I've had a lot of individuals refuse to debate me, even because knowing my past experiences, because it puts them in a position where they have to now try to delegitimize me as a Muslim.
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing to do when you're either not Muslim or have very little understanding of Islam, you know, to try and, it's like, imagine I came up into debate and tried to discredit why someone wasn't authentically Western. Like, how do you begin to do that?
Well, you know, and it's also something that intimidates them, and that wasn't the purpose of me doing it. Obviously, I did it because I wanted to, and because I felt it was the right thing to do. But, you know, obviously, you know, but the thing is, it's intimidating to them because, you know, a lot of these people who criticize Islam, the Robert Spencers, the David Woods, you know, all these random internet trolls, they're completely irrelevant people. Like, they've never done anything to help anyone. You know, all they do is complain all day on social media and post memes. They have never ever lifted a finger to help any victim of terrorism or to stop terrorism at all. So when a Muslim comes out and is like, yeah, I've actually done something, you know, all of their work, every word that they've posted online for hours on end every single day becomes irrelevant, and they can't handle that.
Exactly. Like, you know, that's why I wanted to bring it up with you, because we don't, you know, hear enough of stories like what you've been through, because we only bombarded with a certain narrative in the media. I may have to wrap things up quickly, but I do want to ask you a quick question. It's been very, alhamdulillah, very insightful podcast, but we ask this question to our guests all the time. It's actually becomes one of the hardest questions, to be honest. So if there were three people in history you want to chill with in a cave, because, you know, boys in the cave, who would they be? So excluding Sahaba and Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, because everyone's going to pick them, obviously. Let's just assume they're already in the cave for, you know, sake of adab. So and then so you can pick like three people in history you'd like to chill with.
Three people. They can be historical figures.
Yeah, they can be anyone in history. Yeah.
That's interesting. That is a difficult question because I can name so many.
Yeah, that's why it stifles quite a few.
Number one. Let me think. I'm just going to name something at the top of my head, so this is not going to be like some formal response. I'll have to make a list later. So, okay, Bruce Lee.
Oh, swell.
Would be
interesting, yeah.
Because he was like my idol prior to being Muslim. And he's still somebody I look up to. As a genuine, like, very excellent human being in many respects. Number two, I guess a historical Islamic figure would definitely be Salahuddin. I love to just talk to him and just be like, how did you do it? You killed you beat everyone. Like, what happened? You know, tell me, please. And who else? God. Oh man, some of these people, this person you may not even know. My personal philosophical hero was Thomas Kuhn. He passed away in 1996, and I was far too young back then to know him. and he was probably the biggest influence on my philosophical thinking as a philosopher. And I would have really loved to sit down and chill with him, just talk to him how he came to his conclusion. He was the guy who wrote the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The word paradigm that you've noted that we've said several times throughout this podcast, he came up with that word.
Oh wow! So
he's influenced the understanding of science forever. Without him, I would not have been able to write that lengthy paper that we discussed as well. So yeah.
Those are great answers to this question.
I hope they are. I don't know if they're better than everyone else's.
No, we had we're talking about because Justin Parra actually helped us get in touch with you. So he actually said his mother first up. So I don't think anyone can beat. Oh no, his wife. Yeah, I don't think anyone can beat that answer. But
see, the thing is, I didn't mention my wife because I'm going to see her in Jannah, so we're all good.
Hey, so good save.
The chess game between Justin
and I spend all my time with her in a cave every day, so it's not a big deal.
SubhanAllah. But regardless, I have to wrap things up. Rafael's got class. We don't, want to talk all intellectual stuff and help make him fail uni, so that'd be a bit ironic. But Jazakallah khair, Asadullah Ali, for coming on Boys in the Cave. It was really insightful podcast. A lot of people will inshallah benefit from it, even with people with shubahat, doubts, because we touched on a lot of topics that inshallah will strengthen iman, and also went into length about science and all that. But I hope you enjoyed your time on Boys in the Cave.
No, Jazakallah khair for having me on, and I did enjoy my time, and I thought it was beneficial not only for myself, but I hope for everyone else. And I really enjoyed it. I hope to come back.
Alhamdulillah, yeah, definitely. We'll definitely be in touch, and we'll definitely keep for more conversations. And if people want to find your stuff, where can they find you?
They can find me on, I don't post much on social media as much anymore, but I'm on Facebook, Asadullah Ali Al-Andalusi. You can find me on my website, asadullahali.com, and you can find me on Yaqeen Institute. I have several articles and lectures on there as well, and my YouTube channel, Andalusian Project. So there you go.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll pull those links in the show notes, inshallah, so people can check those out. And even you have like your articles on like websites, as in your academic articles. So I definitely will link that so people can check it out, inshallah. Yeah. So from our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook, and you can help follow our journey through Instagram. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us, and support us a lot on patreon.com. We got many tires you can inshallah benefit from, and you can see this inshallah the podcast grow with our production level. So from our special guest Asadullah, Rafael, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.